but it's really,
Ready to go?
no, I can't say anything. Yeah, nice talking with you, Kurt.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. We are at 8:30, and we'll get started. Happy to call the meeting of the Save Our Indian River Lagoon Project Plan Citizen Oversight Committee for July. Call that to order, and if we could start with the Pledge of Allegiance.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, and we'll move over to roll call.
Good morning. Lorraine Koss?
Here.
Charles Venuto? Here. Vinnie Toronto?
Here.
Don Dice? Here. John Windsor?
Here.
Terry Casto is not here, maybe watching. Bobby Putnam?
Here.
Laura Lee Thompson?
Here.
Stephanie Ely is not here. Kimberly Newton is not here. Todd Swingle?
Here.
Kurt Smith? Here. Barbara Wall-Scanlon?
Here.
Eric Manns? Here. We have a quorum.
Okay, and we do have a quorum, and Dr. Windsor, as you heard, is online and has extenuating circumstances and unable to attend. And if it is the pleasure of the committee, I would like to ask for a vote to allow Dr. Windsor to participate as a full voting member, even though remote. That is allowed since we do have an in-person quorum subject to approval. So if that is okay with the committee, I'd ask for a motion second. And
So moved.
Second.
okay, I have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Dr. Windsor, you are able to participate in full. I would just ask that because of some of the potential feedback on microphones, if any of you are, whenever you're not speaking, please turn them off, and remember to turn them back on where you see the green light when you're ready to speak. And with that, I will move on to approval of the agenda.
So moved.
Se-
I have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? The agenda is approved unanimously. We'll move on to approval of minutes. The minutes are in your packet.
Move to approve.
I have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Hearing none. All in favor for approval?
Aye.
All
Aye.
opposed? All opposed? Passes unanimously. We will move on to progress and fiscal reports. The monthly progress report, I'll turn it over to Virginia.
Good morning, thank you. So leaky laterals repairs, we are up to 431 of the 646 detected, so that's about 2/3 of them repaired now. Septic upgrades, 12 more reimbursements were completed and processed. Quick connects, 10 more of those have been reimbursed. UCF monitoring, also this is a significant uptick in the quick connects to sewer. We've been doing additional mail outs, and so those have been going out in metered out in several hundred at a time, and so those the participant rate has been significant in response to that additional mail out. UCF went out and did monitoring of the oyster projects at McNabb Park in Cocoa Beach, and the majority of the oysters in both size classes in the gabions are surviving and have grown since deployment. So that project has multiple different deployment types and deployment ages and variations on the theme, and so we're looking at lots of different details there, but it's going well so far. And then at your stations, you should see 2 different field guides that we have just published. funded with TDC Lagoon grant dollars, one on manatees and one on recreational opportunities. And these are being printed and distributed around the county where we hope they will intercept people and they will learn more about the lagoon and how to interact with it in a friendly and proper way. So we're excited about having these new tools and appreciate the funding from the TDC to do those. Right now, those are hand-folded because the folding machine at the printers is being uncooperative, and so they are slightly behind schedule on their delivery date, but hopefully that will get all worked out here shortly. They are printed. We've gotten that far. So work underway this month. We've had meetings with the state regarding the new legislation and rollout of the Indian River Lagoon Protection Program. And of course, DEP state staff are also trying to figure out what that means and what they're supposed to be doing and what we're supposed to be doing. And so we're all trying to figure that out together. Matt Culver has worked on removing 5 more derelict vessels. The in-ground nitrogen-reducing biofilter system as a passive alternative to advanced septic. That study is done, and the final report has been written and revised, and we're doing one final review before we send it to the state. So we are looking forward to having approval for that system from the state. South Central C septic sewer that keeps inching closer and closer to completion where people can actually hook up. They're at nearly 92% complete. The Miko sewer line extension, that's moving along very nicely, and they're now installing those lateral stub outs for the gravity section of that project at the south end. So we expect that to be done and for everyone to be able to connect in December. The Brevard County septic sewer projects that are under design, a lot of those projects have been in sort of some stage of 75% design underway or design under review or design comments sent back and whatever. So now some of those have moved to the 90% design stage. Melbourne High School funeral home baffle box construction is underway. The Basin 1398 Sand Dollar Canal vegetation harvesting, this says underway, but it was actually completed last week. Grand Canal muck dredging is underway. Sykes Creek muck dredging is underway. Sykes Creek Phase 2, the RFQ for engineering consulting services has closed, so we're reviewing the submittals for that. O'Galley muck dredging, we've selected the consultant for that and had a kickoff or having a kickoff meeting. The Canaveral South muck dredging, the sediment sampling has been done. We're reviewing that report. We've got a number of videos in process and underway, and I'll just highlight, we need lagoon stories from our 4 new members, so if you haven't scheduled that with Brandon, please get that on the agenda when you can. And septic maintenance commercials, we've finished with the storyboards for those, and those are being filmed now, so we'll look forward to sharing those with you soon. In terms of presentations this month, Anthony actually facilitated a session on septic at the Florida Water Resources Conference, and Aaliyah and Abby presented at the O'Galley EGAD Sounds of the Lagoon event. And not listed here because we didn't present, but certainly worthy of mentioning, on July 10th, the Water Management District was here and had a partnering event. They had multiple members of their governing board here speaking. Their executive director was here speaking. They brought in the Secretary of DEP, Sean Hamilton, who spoke, Senator Mayfield, and Representatives Altman and Aaron Grawl also spoke. So it was a really nice event in Melbourne on the waterfront. In terms of volunteer participation opportunities, at the bottom of that list, it says Pineda Waterway Warrior cleanups are every second and fourth Saturday. We just received a notice this week that due to the heat, they are only going to meet on the second Saturdays of the month in August and September. So I just didn't want people showing up on the fourth Saturday for the next 2 months wondering where everybody is. And under future topics for special presentations, we have a few additions based on your feedback. There's a lot of seagrass sightings going on in the lagoon, so we're hoping to get some speakers on that to bring you some details. We had a request for information on the horseshoe crab spawning, which we have some amazing sights in the lagoon, so more of just a happy critter report. And then the lagoon, so the Water Management District several years ago did a feasibility study looking for sort of bigger projects that could be done to improve water quality in the lagoon. And one of the projects on that list was the M1 Crane Creek rediversion project. That's how that came to be. So they're now doing that exercise again. And so once they have a list of projects, we'd like to hear from them what those are. So we've added those to the list. If you're okay with those or have others, please let us know. All right. And then one other thing we wanted to highlight are some video clips. We've been working with Crawford Productions on a short series called Protect Our Paradise that is funded by the state of Florida. And Logan's gonna, so these are the second episode of the series is on water in Florida, and they featured some areas here. So before Logan hits go, the person on the left there is Jennifer Thompson in our office. You've heard her speak to this panel before on the results of stormwater monitoring, so we just wanted to share a couple of these little trailers for this.
This isn't the first one. Logan, this isn't the first one.
But it was a great segue for me. Thanks, Logan. Is that it?
No, the one that's labeled 1.
It's early.
So that is what we're combating.
We're in a crisis situation.
If it gets any more serious, we won't be able to swim.
Smells like death.
Water's everything.
This is disgusting.
It angers me.
This is the rock star of everything we're doing here.
If we do it right, it's a sustainable future.
The land that we save is going to have a direct impact on our water quality.
We need to act now. So we're going to take a core sample.
So this is all stormwater?
Yes, coming from the residential side of the city.
Just jump right in there.
I do. So. Wow. That's all your muck, and the sand is way down here at the very base.
Why specifically is this so bad for the environment?
So the muck actually re-releases all the nutrients. Oh. So this is definitely not good, not what we want to see. Oh, yeah.
That was just right on the surface there.
So that is what we're combating. Our project site treats this water, gets rid of a lot of this muck, and we're going to see downstream just how different it is. Obviously, this is tremendously different.
You've got to be kidding me. Look at the difference of that, Jennifer. So what's happening between where we first took this sample and where we are now?
That water is trickling underground through media, and it's actually kicking in the nitrogen cycle.
Cleaning the water,
yep.
I mean, I just want to point out, we were just right down there. I mean, that can't be no more than 30, 40 yards.
Yeah.
So all that's happening between there and right here.
You got it. The data that we're collecting not only shows that what we're doing is working the way we thought it would, sometimes it even exceeds expectations.
This is a community that sent man to the moon. This is a community that invents new solutions, and we spread that knowledge to the rest of the state.
Everything that's happening in this system, it's all cleaner water going out to the lagoon.
Yeah, we have a friend that lives in Cocoa Beach on one of the canals, and she was doing really, really good growing oysters in cages under her dock, and then after it started raining, they all died. Are we seeing that in other canals, or she does have a stormwater discharge thing that's real close to her dock, but are we seeing those problems in other places now that it's raining? And then my other comment is, it's fantastic that we are filtering the water that's going into the lagoon and cleaning it up, but especially up in the north end, too much fresh water is altering the salinity regime, and we can't get oyster. The zoo won't even do oysters and clam projects up by Titusville because we have so much freshwater influence and so many freshwater discharges. So I think it's great that we're doing the we're taking the nutrients out, but I think we're missing the boat on the message that even though we clean up the water, it's still not good for a healthy lagoon to have too much fresh water going into it. Thank you.
So I looked at Jenny to see if she had details on the gardens dying, and I don't think you have, anything. But, it's not just the rain, it's also the heat. And so the water, especially in those canals, just heat up, and they can't hold much oxygen. And so, this is a tough time of year for all critters in the lagoon. And your point about fresh water is absolutely right. So it's not just about cleaning the water, it's also about retaining it in, wetlands and other treatment systems, and then releasing it at a slower, more natural rate so that you don't have those shocks to the salinity that critters aren't used to.
Okay. Vinny?
Yeah, Virginia, just a quick question about the in-ground nitrogen-reducing biofilter system. So that was what we were working with DEP for a couple years about running some tests, right? And so once that's done, is that another tool or project type that we may be able to then look at implementing?
Yes, that is the intent. So we have collected the data, we've analyzed it multiple ways, and so DEP now needs to look at that data and analyze it how they see fit, and then make a determination as to whether those systems would be allowed statewide as another tool in the toolbox.
Okay, and I know if you had a crystal ball, you wouldn't be here because you would be the Powerball winner a couple days ago. But do you think that we may see projects of that type this year, or is that something maybe not until next year?
We are very hopeful. We believe that the data demonstrates that these systems perform, but there are different ways to analyze the data, and so we don't know what DEP is going to determine.
Okay.
Then while they would be, once they make that determination, that methodology would be immediately available to the public. That doesn't mean that there are people out there marketing that they're going to construct those. So there may be a lag between, when it's on DEP's sheet as an option versus when they start going into the ground.
Okay. So a tortoise hair thing. And I'm team tortoise, I guess. We're good. All right. Thank you.
Well, on that line, on that note as well, are those more, I guess they're suitable for both retrofit and new systems?
Yes. Yes.
So one of the things I'd continue to encourage us to do is to influence local governments for their standards and things of that nature, because it's always easier to do it when something's going in new than it is to go back and fix something. So just that conversation.
So part of the new Indian River Lagoon Protection Program, the state's new program, is that all new septic must be advanced as of July 1st, so 3 weeks ago. So this would be
That would be on the
another
septic
tool
side, but
for
this,
people
this
to
is
meet.
also applicable for stormwater as well, though, right?
The same media has been used in stormwater for over a decade. That's why we thought it ought to work in a drain field.
On that sewer side, just a question on the quick connects. The quick connects are where there's sewer available, correct? And that
Yes.
that folks then are, pay their impact fees and connect into the system. And I see we've got 260 agreements in process, and that there were 175 applications. Do we know what the total potential entitlement is? So how many of these exist that have sewer available that could connect right away within our system? Do we have a sense of that?
We have a map of that. I don't know the number off the top of my head. I know in the original plan, we had identified, I think, 1,600 priority locations that were adjacent to existing lines. What we've learned since then is that some of those lines were major trunk lines that you wouldn't want to tap into. And so those numbers have adjusted a bit over time. And of course, we've updated our model in terms of which septic are loading the most. But it's that order of magnitude.
Okay. Just again, I think we've had this discussion before, but there are state law provisions to require people to connect if it's available. And I think at some point, I'm entirely supportive of our incentivizing, but at some point then we need to also use the enforcement provisions as well. So I'd ask the staff just to take a look at that piece to understand what those entitlements are and where we are, and again, work with our local government partners to make sure that we're enforcing state law and using those tools to get where we need to go. Obviously, we understand there's financial impacts on folks, but that's why these monies are here. But if people aren't taking advantage of it, we've at some point got to move to that type of enforcement approach.
Along that line, I just had a conversation with someone that was regarding that subject, and he said, well, it's not available to me because I'm like 1,100 feet from it. And I said, well, you don't get a choice. If it's available, that's considered available. And so he's digging his heels in, but that may be one of the types of people that you're talking about.
It could be, but there are some state law provisions where a single-family home 1,100 feet would not be considered. So there are some state law that provides some distances on those.
Is that right?
So for a single-family residential lot, it has to be available in either right-of-way or easement abutting the property line. As you get to larger developments, then that distance grows significantly. So like this individual would depend on whether they're an individual property owner or a development, because I think there's about 3 different levels between individual properties and then some large-scale development. So,
interesting.
So some of those provisions do exist. There's some state law definition of what availability means.
Well, I hope it's considered quote-unquote available, because these two gentlemen both live right on the river.
Yeah.
But it's a jaunt for them to get to
Right, there are a number of very deep lots, and so even where there may be a gravity line in the right-of-way, to get their sewage from their house to that gravity line can require a pump, a lift pump. And so communities have not always mandated that connection, but we can review how those rules apply and make sure everybody's aware of.
They have not mandated those, but pumps are, if the line is present abutting the property line, even if it's a pumped system, that is still subject to that state law requirement. So that is not, in its own right
An
a
excuse.
valid exemption.
Good to know.
Laura?
So for some of these really deep lots, there's sewer that's out by, say, like Tropical Trail, but it's a long, long way to where the house is on the river. If they couldn't run a line all the way up to the street, does state law require them to have the advanced wastewater septic systems then?
So first of all, I think the newer state law does require conversion within a certain timetable. So that wasn't historically the requirement, but with the legislative actions this year, that is the case. But again, a pump with a small diameter line is very viable even over some higher distances. And those are candidly pretty cost effective as well.
Yeah, so was that 2030 that those are required?
I don't know the date.
Wasn't it 2030?
2030 is the date for the OSTDS upgrade of the existing OSTDS. I think the connections is like 2025.
Yeah, I think
It's much
for new,
sooner.
it's only a couple years. For existing conversions, it's slightly longer. I don't remember the exact dates.
Yeah, we have to have, all the communities have to submit a plan to DEP about how they're going to enforce connections, where they're going to bring sewer, how they're going to upgrade septic. Those are due by mid-January of 2024, this
okay.
coming January.
And just going back to the nitrogen-reducing biofilter system, is that is that like a medium within the baffle box?
Well, similar media is also used in third-generation baffle boxes, but this is placed in the drain field.
Actually in the drain fields, okay. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And with that, I think we'll move on to the monthly revenue graph and financial statements.
Okay. Hi, I'm Molly Bryan. I am an accountant with Sorrel. So we received $4.5 million in collections for April, and that puts us at $329 million collected so far in the program. And we are $737,000 below county projections. And for the monthly financial table, we have $292 million in revenues assigned as of this fiscal year. And on the expenditure side, we have $58 million assigned for projects, and we spent $15 million so far this fiscal year. Any questions? Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
No additional questions there. We'll move on to other reports and special presentations. And our first presentation will be impacts of glyphosate on seagrass growth and nutrient cycle by Dr. Austin Fox. Oh, sorry about that. So we'll move on to our next presentation, which is impacts of glyphosate on seagrass growth, and try saying that a bunch, and nutrient cycling. Dr. Austin Fox, welcome.
Well, thank you for having me. I guess I would do this on a rotisserie, but the mic is over here, so I apologize to everybody back here. So anyways, before I jump into this, I just really want to say something about collaboration. So this project came about, glyphosate was out of my wheelhouse until recently. Most of you know me for nutrients, and so I tell people I accidentally got into glyphosate and seagrasses, and you'll hear a little bit about that here. But this was made possible through a small grant. So I was working with students, helped a student put together a small grant proposal through the National ESSER Program, so thank you to the National ESSER Program for making this possible. And then without Brevard Zoo, and then Laura has a permit, she took the Brevard Zoo folks, the Restore Our Shores folks out to actually collect some of the seagrasses, so we didn't actually have to kill seagrass that somebody grew in a nursery. And so we took these orphaned fragments to use for this study. And so a ton of people to thank, so the really collaborative effort as I jump into this. And so how did I get here? How did we get here? And yes, I know this is Clerk, but it's the best picture of SAV that I had. So I got here because of the public concern regarding the toxicity of glyphosate in the IRL. And I want to stop for a moment to just talk about headlines, right? And so I drink Diet Coke. If you look at the headlines, I'm going to die, right? But if you actually look at those studies, it would take me drinking like 6,000 Diet Cokes per day to get to the concentrations where they actually may have seen some impacts. And so you'll notice me talking about the difference in concentrations between the studies and the actual in situ concentrations as we move through this. And so my interest, right? I'm not a glyphosate person, or I wasn't. I'm a nutrient person. And so I got into this because I'm interested in tracking the nutrients. We're all here talking about reducing nutrient inputs to the Indian River Lagoon. And so glyphosate somehow fits into that story because decaying biomass releases nutrients, and some of the herbicides contain some amount of nutrients also, and I'll talk about that as we move through this. And so there's public interest in looking at the concentration of glyphosate in places like the Indian River Lagoon. There is some preliminary data, so ORCA with the Day in the Life program has generated a little bit of data. And the fact that we detect it is worrisome to some people. But as a trace element chemist, we should detect it, right? If you have the right equipment and the right methods, you can detect just about anything, anywhere. Unless you give me soil from under a building that was built in the 30s, I can find anthropogenic signals. And so as an advisor, right, I took this on kind of as a side project because it sort of fits in. I was interested in the nutrients, like I said. So I worked with students to ask the question, we have some concentrations in the lagoon, but how much does it take to be a problem? And so we started to address this. Again, this is a small grant, so it's a pretty limited study. But we started to try to put those values that we have for the lagoon into perspective, or generate a framework to look at the concentrations that we have. And so had I not been an environmental scientist, I would have been a crop duster. A little bit of irony there, but these are the real chemtrails. And so I start with that just to say, I'm sure you're all very familiar with glyphosate, but it is used extensively in agriculture, right? Your food, I was going to bring props. I was going to bring some strawberries and offer you all some glyphosate. But in recent studies out of France, right, 99.8% of the human urine samples, over 6,000 participants, contained glyphosate. Right? You look at human tissues, human blood, human urine, it contains glyphosate. I'm not saying this is a good thing. I'm just saying that's the world we live in today. Right? And so when we hear about glyphosate in manatees and those kinds of things, it's absolutely not a good thing, but that's just the world that we live in. I would love to see no glyphosate anywhere, but that's the world we live in. And if you're interested, 40 CFR 183.64 gives you a list of how much glyphosate is allowed to be on your food. So just letting you know this stuff is ubiquitous. Why glyphosate? Right? It's a non-selective herbicide, so that means it works against plants, just keeping this really simple. It is translocated. You spray it on the leaves, it takes it in, pumps it to the roots, goes through the whole plant, kills it. This is really effective against regrowth compared to a lot of other herbicides that just kill the above-ground biomass. It works by inhibiting a plant-specific amino acid synthesis pathway, and this same pathway is not carried out by vertebrates, right? And so the fact that that same pathway is not impacting vertebrates means it's relatively non-toxic to humans as the active ingredient, right? It still is an organic compound, and so it can have some other impacts, but the active ingredients are not actually toxic to humans. And so because of this, it's considered one of the safer herbicides. If you start to go look for alternatives, it's horrifying what's out there. And so I'll talk about alternatives in just a second, but thus it's wide application. So from an environmental perspective, the best thing I can tell you about glyphosate is it has a very short half-life, ranging from a few weeks to maybe a year in the perfect conditions to preserve it, right? This stuff in topsoil, in the water, 2 weeks, it's based 50% of it's gone. That's the half-life. It's about 2 to 3 weeks. The good thing about that is it means that active ingredient is not accumulating, right? And so that's kind of why I got into this, is the things that are accumulating are the byproducts, the nutrients that are coming from the decaying biomass and to some extent from the things themselves. So alternatives, right? as we talk about getting rid of something because of those headlines, the things that have gotten into the public's eye, we need to be sure that we don't jump to something that is actually worse, right? And so a lot of the alternatives that are out there are either less effective or highly toxic, or even in some cases, both of those things combined. And so one of the homework assignments for you all, this is something I give my students in my pollution class, is pick something that the public is against, right? Straws. Right? Look at the alternatives. And you can look at, are the alternatives actually any better? Look at the impacts of paper processing, right? Look at the impacts of making stainless steel. And so we actually have to weigh all of these things as we switch to alternatives. And so my comment, you'll hear me mention potentially mechanical harvesting. That's something that's brought up a lot as an alternative. Even that has some impacts. It's not the toxic impacts, but CO2, right? Potentially some grease and oil and those kinds of things. And so one of those is glyphosate. The other one, I'm not even going to go there. It should probably be illegal in Florida in 2023. So glyphosate concentrations in the Indian River Lagoon. These are from ORCA, and these are reported as parts per billion. One sample over their 4 years of studying that is publicly available is greater than 1 part per billion. That means that the rest of these are a couple of hundred parts per trillion, right? We're talking parts per trillion levels in the lagoon. And so I was told, some of you think in milligrams per liter. That is zero. The average for the 4 years is 0.00025 milligrams per liter, right? Pretty low concentrations, but we need some context. And so that's where we got into this. So to grow seagrasses, we set up tanks. We have the Aqua Lab at Florida Tech. We took advantage of that. We set up some tanks. We talked to all the people we knew that were involved with seagrasses to get the best ways to do that. So we set up tanks, and then thank you to Laura Lee. She took some people from Restore Our Shores out. They helped us collect seagrass fragments. We planted them in the tanks and started this really nice grow-out facility to then be able to test the impacts of glyphosate and other things on seagrasses. And so I heard some talk about nutrient media earlier. So these were actually grown in tanks using our bottle cap system that some of you may have heard about, so using that biological nutrient removal. They're grown for 30 weeks prior to experience. This is kind of standard in the literature, making sure things are nice, customized to the environment before you start experimenting on them. So we dug into the literature. And there are studies from all over, a few different places around the world related to glyphosate and seagrasses. Not much in this area. And so we used what we could find to come up with some general dosings. We would have loved to do more concentrations, but this again was a small grant project, mostly carried out by students. And so we went with 0, the control, 1 part per million, 100 parts per million, and 1,000 parts per million. The thing that I'll note here is our lowest dose is 1,000 times higher than the concentration in the lagoon, right? And so these doses were based on literature. I think we're planning to go back and narrow down a little bit now, just because there wasn't much to start from. So there are many ways to quantify or qualitatively evaluate the health of seagrasses. One of them is from shoot counts and color. And so we went online and got a color chart and printed it out. If you need to paint your walls, this might be helpful if you like green. But we put this basically in all of our pictures so we could have a reference of the color. And so this is after 2 weeks, the control. And so you can see the seagrasses are still there. 1,000 times the lagoon concentrations looks very much like our control, hardly any difference. Again, 1,000 times higher concentrations of glyphosate than have ever been reported in the lagoon. We get to 100 milligrams per liter of glyphosate, and suddenly it looks a little bit different. Maybe not what you would expect, right, if we're using an herbicide. And then 1,000 milligrams per liter, it's just dead. We pretty much nuked it. And so blade coloration, basically no change in the control or that 1 milligram per liter. And then in the 100 milligrams per liter, we actually saw greening. The leaves got greener. That wasn't the leaves. That was epiphytes. That's algae growing on top of the leaves. It's actually detrimental to the seagrasses. And so I'll touch on that later. And then 1,000 milligrams per liter, pretty much everything died, right? And so some really, really interesting, not quite what we were expecting, but because I got in this looking at nutrients, I was like, this is so cool. This is exactly what I would have expected. And so on that note, we also tracked light, so kind of turbidity, how much light is the glyphosate reducing light. No difference, right? We actually saw slightly better light penetration in our lowest dose, that 1,000 times the concentration in the lagoon, but then light did drop off as we got into those very high concentrations, partially because, and I'll talk about this towards the end, but there's other stuff in the water. And so there's a couple of better measures, right? Some of it's biomass that's really hard to do, just it's all destructive, but we chose to go with leaf chlorophyll. And so to do this, it's destructive. We can only do it once. We did it with some as we were putting it into the tanks, and then we did it with some at the very end of the experiments. We harvest the grass, we homogenize it, we digest it in alcohol to extract the chlorophyll. We run it, that's a graph, but I will kind of summarize the data up here. In the control with Rupia, so we did Rupia and Haliduli, we saw a 16% decrease in the leaf chlorophyll in the control. So this is probably related to the stress of transplanting into our experimental mesocosms. Compared to that, our lowest dose, 1,000 times the concentration of the lagoon, we saw a modest 38% decrease compared to the 16% in the control. And then at 100 and 1,000 ppm, we saw 90 and 99% decreases. So if you add massive quantities of glyphosate, yes, you will see some mortality. So Haliduli, pretty similar story, still a modest decrease, 22%. I will point out that these decreases in the control were not statistically significant. There's just a massive natural variability in the leaf chlorophyll in seagrasses in the lagoon. And so this is looking at just a nice picture of those tanks, getting you to think about that green color. And what causes green stuff in the lagoon? Right? Nutrients. And so tracking the phosphorus. Again, this is the reason I got into this, is as we add things like herbicides, we decay biomass that can lead to nutrients entering the lagoon. And so we tracked the phosphorus. We used pretty clean seawater because we didn't want to use, we used filtered seawater in these experiments because we didn't want to introduce anything that was already in our lagoon system. There's a lot of data here. The only thing I want you to look at is this little red box here, the before. Right? So the initial concentration of total dissolved phosphorus in our controls and in all of these treatments was 0.3 micromoles per liter. Right? In the lagoon, the average is about 1. If you do the math, adding 1 part per million of glyphosate acid will yield about 6 micromoles per liter of phosphate. Right? So simply adding our lowest concentration of glyphosate acid to the lagoon, where we saw a modest decrease in leaf chlorophyll, would increase the phosphate concentrations by 6-fold, right? And so suddenly, it's not the toxicity, it's not the herbicide itself that I'm worried about, it's the nutrients, right? And so based on all of this, this is a brief summary of what we did, because just a lot of things to go through. We put together this conceptual model showing kind of the potential adverse impacts of glyphosate on lagoon seagrasses based on this study. So glyphosate dose, right? Because glyphosate breaks down over time, the concentration that we see is effectively based on the amount that we're adding over time. If we stop adding it, we're going to see a lower concentrations. If we add more, we'll see higher, but it's not going to accumulate, right? So the lagoon concentrations currently, again, 0.00025 milligrams per liter, is way below where we're likely seeing any toxicity from either the nutrient additions from that herbicide use or from the herbicide toxicity itself. And we predict, based on these data, that as you add herbicides, you're going to see the impacts of algal chlorophyll, so of decreased light, long before you see any toxicity impacts, based on this study, based on everything else we've seen in the literature. And so, aquatic weeds, right? Why are we using herbicides in the first place? To treat aquatic weeds. And so the recommended dosage of glyphosate for aquatic weeds is about 0.75 pounds per acre, right? And glyphosate acid contains 18% phosphorus by mass, 8% nitrogen. That's 0.14 pounds of phosphorus and 0.06 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. Compare that to the biomass of hydrilla. So this is just the data from IFIS for hydrilla, and we can go 20 to 30,000 pounds of wet biomass of hydrilla per acre per year. 95% water, so that's about 1,000 to 1,500 pounds of dry weight. If that is 2 to 5% nitrogen, about 0.3% phosphorus, that works out to about 40 pounds of nitrogen and 3 pounds of phosphorus per acre per year coming in from the decaying biomass, right? To put that in perspective, the herbicide accounts for about 4% of the phosphate and 0.1% of the nitrogen. pretty negligible compared to that biomass. So if we compare that to the 6 micromolars that we achieved by adding glyphosate acid, that would take it to 150 micromolar, right? We would have increased the phosphate concentration in the lagoon 150 times what it currently is to get to our lowest dose in our experiments, right? There is no doubt in my mind that the problem with herbicides is actually the potential for eutrophication rather than the acute toxicity if we're talking about something like glyphosate. So when we add to this decaying biomass, I was pretty generous. I should have made this bulge a lot bigger. But that light limitation number is going to shift over, like I said, making it so there's no doubt in my mind that it is the potential for eutrophication that is causing the problem. And so if herbicides lead to the growth of algae, right, so that's what they're doing, we said that's the next step, right? What is that green stuff that we were seeing? And so this is something we're working on currently. This is just us volunteering and getting people. So this was Brevard Zoo internship. We have an intern here and then just students. We're all volunteering our nights and weekends to make this thing possible. So we set up a bunch of different jars with different concentrations to just lagoon water. There's no seagrass, there's no sediments. We're just seeing, do we see a change in the algal composition as we add glyphosate? And this is interesting. Our control is on your right. As you move to the left, there's higher and higher concentrations, and you see some green, right? It's not in the control, right? After more time, so this is a couple weeks later, the green is actually moving to the left, right? What's happening? I believe that we're seeing the breakdown of the active ingredient, right? It's no longer toxic, but the nutrients are still there, and so we're seeing the movement of the algae across to higher and higher concentrations. And so we took these water samples, we put them under the microscope, we're trying to see, is the glyphosate, there are studies out there showing that glyphosate can affect different algae in different ways, right? So we could actually be seeing a change in the algal community composition. Are we favoring different algae by adding these herbicides? And so I'm going to end with this one. I have a little bit more data if people have questions, but I didn't label these, so this is after a couple of weeks, and you can pick which one is which is the control, and this is just one of the concentrations. They all look about like this. Herbicide did that. And so the takeaway message from this is glyphosate in the IRL is really at parts per trillion levels, right? So a few hundred parts per trillion. All of the data that we're able to find, other than using some home remedies, right, that aren't as effective, it is one of the safer herbicides on the market. At 1 ppm, 1,000 times higher concentrations than we're seeing in the lagoon, there were modest impacts to the seagrasses, right? And I get questions about chronic impacts. If we were to test chronic impacts at the lagoon concentrations, there's no doubt in my mind that it would be virtually identical to get any quantitative statistically significant impacts because of all of the other things that seagrasses are being challenged by and the natural variability in the system. So we could test chronic impacts, but we'd have to be testing it at much higher concentrations once again than is actually in the lagoon. So in my opinion, right, so throwing an opinion in here, the biggest threat from herbicides is eutrophication, and so that decaying biomass, again, can add about 40 and 3 pounds of nitrogen and phosphorus per acre per year. Again, that's based on the numbers for hydrilla. And so I can't end with that. I can say that I can end with BMAPs. The BMAPs do have a precedent for credits for aquatic vegetation removal. I was going to say aquatic weeds, but aquatic vegetation removal. And so one of the reasons that harvesting is not a bigger thing is because it's expensive. And I think, again, this is not my wheelhouse, but we should be leveraging those credits to take advantage of removing this stuff because those credits are based on what's being removed, but the addition of those nutrients, right, kind of a twofold thing there. But overall, my final concluding comment is that the best solution is to prevent the need for this stuff in the first place by addressing the upland and the nutrient pollution, which is, I think, what you're all here to do. So I really appreciate you having me here, and I will take any questions. Again, thank you to all the collaborators, and that's all.
Thank you, and I'll open it up for questions from the committee. Laura Lee?
That was amazing. It really was. But my question is, I have a whole truckload of bottle caps, and they're in my friend's they're in my friend's storeroom and in her shed, and she would like to get rid of them. Are you still looking for bottle caps?
So, the public support has been incredible. The data is incredible. I've never talked about that data here, but it's effectively, it's not a passive nutrient media, it's an active media, but that means that it never goes bad. So it will work forever, so long as we're doing a very little amount of maintenance. So we have enough to do the projects that we're working on now, but our goal is to find more projects, more people who want to take advantage of this system and put it on their docks and things to treat some lagoon water. So yes, we can take them. We'll get them off your hands. I'll get in touch with you.
Okay, thank you. Charlie?
Yeah, so the samples that you obtained in the lagoon, I presume they were somewhere in the water column. Do you think there might be a difference at the application site, and there might be a pulse of the herbicide that could alter, certainly the landscape because it's there to kill plants, and those levels probably might be higher because they're at the application point. It might show some different results and impact to the ecosystem maybe in that envelope area.
So from the Orca data, that highest concentration I mentioned was in one of the tributaries, right? And so the higher concentrations that we're seeing are in closer proximity to where it's being added. However, right, the moment it enters the water, it's being diluted massively. And then it's a short term, it continues to be diluted very quickly. And so it's not like spraying it on the leaves where it can soak it in quickly. It's being exposed to this kind of dilute solution for some period of time. And so, yes, I can imagine that there might be larger impacts if we went to an application site. But I still imagine that it's probably not as big as we might think that it is.
And I think just one of the other issues perhaps with this material and other biocides is that what does it do to the microorganisms that are in the soil where it's being applied? And I know that was not part of the study, but I think that's something also that needs to be, someone should be trying to look at that, because I would imagine that it's impacting those organisms and how that affects different cycles.
So that's a great question. I don't have too much to add other than that is one of my big interests. All the nutrient cycling I look at is bacterial processes in sediments. And so that is kind of where we're headed is what happens within the sediments. I don't have an answer for you.
Okay, other questions? Stephanie?
This was fascinating. And the question that I have is the second part of the study that you did, looking at the nutrient exposure. That was still at levels that are much higher than what's currently in the lagoon.
Yes.
So what do you think realistically at the level that we see these herbicides in the lagoon, what is the nutrient impact there?
So I guess the standing stock, so what is currently there would be 0.18% of 0.00025 milligrams per liter. But that is what is currently there, right? The half-life of the herbicide itself, right, is breaking down, but that phosphorus is still staying in the system. And it is, again, the nutrients coming in with the decaying biomass. Nitrogen, we love to talk about nitrogen because there are biological processes that convert it to forms that leave. Phosphorus has two fates. It's either buried in sediments or discharged to the ocean, right? And my concern, and so again, like I said, my main focus is nutrients, and phosphorus is something that's particularly, I spent a lot of time thinking about. I think we're running out of the ability to hold phosphorus on the sediments. We've done another study, and it's I tell people that's what nightmares are made out of. But we're running out of the ability to store phosphorus in Lagoon, which means it's going to go up. If you look back to 2010, at the same time we saw a regime shift or a new stable state with algae, phosphate concentrations in the Lagoon basically just had a really huge jump, almost doubled overnight. And I think I can explain that. We don't have data at the time, but we're now looking at the processes and mechanisms, and it's the soil is less able to hold that phosphorus. And so that's why I'm talking about we need to be mitigating the inputs of the phosphorus.
So that brings me to another question. So removing muck, is that part of the solution? That it's going to then allow the soil that's underneath it to have more capacity for collecting phosphorus?
Absolutely, yes. So when we look at a lot of the muck deposits in the lagoon, most of them, if you look at the adjacent sand, the sand is up here, the muck is down here, and we would think that you could fill it with muck to the top, right? But the settling energy of the fine grains is actually less than the settling energy of sand, and so this may be full. And what's happening, and what we're seeing, the data is showing that there is muck where it hasn't been before. Right? And that's because it's no longer accumulating in some of these places where it used to. So like muck deposits, they're full, they're overflowing. So if we aren't getting it out, it's going to spread to other places. And so addressing the internal recycling is absolutely important. I think muck dredging is an essential piece of that. I think we need to be doing other things also, but that's absolutely an essential piece of it to allow some of those other more subtle feedback loops to take place.
Thank you. Others? Eric?
Okay, we just watched some, or had some presenters last time we came in, and part of their discussion was glyphosate as being an attacker of the roots more so than the leaves, and I don't know if you had any insights there or didn't seem to get addressed. So
it attacks the whole plant, so you spray it on the leaves, and it's translocated, so it's basically pumped by the plant to all of the different tissues, and so it kills the whole thing, which prevents it from coming back. Some of the alternatives, you spray it on the top, it kills the leaves, but the roots aren't killed, and so it comes back quickly. And so I think that's what they're talking about. It's just it attacks the whole plant, including the roots, which is kind of the focus if you don't want something to come back.
they weren't necessarily showing a lot of damage or color change to the leaves. It was more so to the roots in the study that we had seen.
Seagrasses?
Yeah, on seagrasses specifically.
So, yeah, I've heard that, and that's something that we did not look at the above ground, below ground biomass. It's something I think we should be looking at to some extent, but we were looking at overall mortality because the root system, if it dies eventually, it's going to have an impact on the leaves. And so we have to pick something to study, and just quantifying above ground, below ground biomass is pretty difficult to do it right. So I think that's something we could look at. I'd like to, but just we were with leaf chlorophyll this time.
Okay.
Good question.
Benny?
So one thing, Eric, I had a seagrass expert tell me that seagrass that was in that presentation, it only is south of the inlet. It's not actually the seagrass that is in the lagoon. I'm not a seagrass expert. I don't know if that means that there's a difference in how that glyphosate affects it, but that was something I found out after the presentation that I wish I would have known before to be able to ask the scientist that presented it. Did I cover that correctly, seagrass expert?
Yeah, they were using Thalassia, not Haliduli or Rupia.
Rupia and Haliduli are two of the very common species in this area.
Yeah, and they were focusing on the root, not really the rhizomes too, and the ability of a manatee to be able to grab it out of the ground, and rather than just chomp on the leaves, to pull the whole plant out. So that was the whole thing.
Interesting.
We do find Thalassia on the shoals around the inlet, but it's not in the beyond that pretty much, and it's very rare even on those shoals.
But that's exactly one of the challenges that we have in this, right? Is we can find studies that have some other species somewhere else, and the concentrations are all over the place for what causes effects. However, I have not found any study at less than 250 times the lagoon concentration where they found any adverse impacts. So again, their below ground biomass loss was probably at some really, I don't know if they, the concentrations they were looking at. Okay. So it's always something to,
Sure.
okay. So always something to keep in mind is just, are they looking at something comparable, or is it just some off the charts, like numbers?
Sorry for outing you, Don.
Okay, any other questions from the committee?
That was really good, thank you. How long did you do the, again, for?
So, I didn't mention that for the actual duration. We let the seagrasses go for 2 weeks once we added the glyphosate. There's a few different numbers out there, but 2 weeks is kind of the acute toxicity threshold. There's some studies that have gone 3, there's some studies that have gone 1. So we ended up at 2, just because we're looking again for those acute toxicity impacts, and if we go longer, you start to have the impacts of just the other challenges of keeping seagrasses alive.
Breaks down and.
That being said, we did get the seagrasses and culture them for 30 weeks before applying the glyphosate to kind of make sure they're happier.
That was my next question. How long did you have them set for?
So that's the
Okay.
most challenging part, is growing and cultivating them for many months before. So
Yeah.
we've learned a lot about growing seagrasses, and it's really nice. We're working with some of the seagrass folks. And so we've learned, and we're sharing information back and forth. So again, it goes back to that collaboration comment.
So you said let's see if I have it right. The algal, you said that, was it growing on the seagrass at a certain point?
Yes.
Not just around, it was actually on.
So we tested, again, I tried to keep it, not too many numbers on here, but we
Yeah.
tested the chlorophyll in the water, and it was, I'm looking at this like bright green mesocosm, and the chlorophyll, dissolved chlorophyll concentration was not off the charts. And so when we actually looked in it and stirred it up and took samples out, it wasn't that green. It was all epiphytic. It was growing on sides and growing on the leaves, which epiphytic algae is pretty bad for seagrasses because it grows on the leaves and definitely prevents that light from getting to it.
More impactful actually to me. Yeah.
And so we're seeing both in this latest round. We're seeing, I think in the most recent numbers, we saw like 2 to 5 micrograms per liter of chlorophyll in the controls, and up to 60 micrograms per liter in some of our glyphosate-treated samples.
Okay, any additional questions from the committee?
Well, I got one more. Just because what Charles and Eric both brought up, I was curious, but since they brought up other stuff, the mycorrhizae, do you know if there's any studies of that? Because I know how impactful that could be on the growth of plants in general. I mean, does this impact any fungal growth? Or
You said mycorrhizae?
Mycorrhizomes?
Oh.
The fungus that grows with the roots and connects the roots to the soil.
I'm not familiar with that. It's not been mentioned in any of the studies I've seen, so it's probably something different to look at. Good question.
Okay, Eric?
Thank you.
So you tested the water specifically. Do you have any insights on glyphosate concentrations in the muck specifically?
So I don't. All I can say is that there are plenty of studies on the degradation. And so again, in UV light, and so in light conditions, oxic conditions, it's going to last 2 to 3 weeks. Or the half-life is 2 to 3 weeks. So half of it's gone after 2 to 3 weeks. If it gets into the muck, and so one of the great things about glyphosate is when it sorbs to particles, that effectively renders it not effective anymore. So that's one of the things people really like about it. So it could stay in the muck for a while, but again, the longest half-life I've seen is like 300 days. And so it's not probably going to last a year, even if it makes its way into the muck. So if you go down, it's unlikely to see it unless there's been some bioturbation, if people are seeing it. So the things that you don't hear all that much about is the methods to do these kinds of things are incredibly difficult. to be clean. So as a trace element chemist, I spend a lot of my time making sure there's no contamination. And so when you get into the parts per trillion levels, it's really easy to contaminate. So if we were to take samples, right, just simply the core barrel going down itself, it's going to move some things downward. So we're careful about that. I'm just saying, if you were to take samples, you may see something, but it's probably going to be very small. And the breakdown says we shouldn't see massive concentrations.
Once it breaks down, you're saying it's not an issue anymore after it's gone through a half-life?
So the half-life, right, half of it's broken down, and so we have this kind of exponential remnant of it. But in terms of acute toxicity from the active ingredient, it would not be effective after that. It wouldn't have any harm. But like I said, the nutrients from the decaying biomass are still, the nitrogen may go through the cycle, but the phosphorus is still going to be there.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate the presentation and the discussion from the committee. Just a note, I saw a couple hands in the back. On these presentations, we do not have public comment on those. If it is an action item from the board, we'll accept additional public comment. But if you do have additional comments that you'd like to raise, we have a general public comment period at the end, and I'd encourage you to fill out a card and raise your comments at that point.
Cool.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
And we will move on to our next topic, which is the local government panel on lessons learned regarding glyphosate restrictions.
Are you going to speak from there? It's up to you.
Yeah.
Good morning, everybody. How you doing? My name is Zach Eichholz. I work for the City of Cape Canaveral and joined by Dave Coulter. I'm in the city's Community and Economic Development Department in charge of its Resilience Division. We're here today to talk to you about glyphosate in the City of Cape Canaveral, or now I should say the lack thereof, at least on our part. So just for some quick background, I think I need glasses because I can't read that. So I'm going to pull it up on my phone. Yeah.
It's right behind you.
Oh, look at that. I didn't want to turn my back to you guys, but the City of Cape Canaveral was incorporated in 1963, and we're a city that is just 1.9 square miles in size, which is about 1,200 acres. We're sandwiched between the Banana River Lagoon and the Atlantic Ocean, up by just south of Port Canaveral and just north of the city of Cocoa Beach. We have a population of roughly 10,000, with 17 public beach crossovers, 11 city-maintained parks, 3 stormwater ponds, 2 of which are at our water reclamation facility, which we have 1 of, as you can see there. We have 1 drainage ditch, which is about 4,000 feet in length, and we have 0 canals. So that just kind of give you a lay of the land. So our history with glyphosate really came onto the books in February of 2021, specifically February 16th, where Resolution 2021-03 unanimously passes by Council, which hereby or henceforth banned all applications of glyphosate-based herbicides in favor of less impactful non-glyphosate alternatives at all city-owned facilities and properties by both staff and contractors. This was a specified goal in the city's 2020 Resiliency Action Plan. It was, I think, the first preparedness target that we were completed in our plan. We have 56 of those. That accounts for about 50 acres of city land area that are impacted by the resolution, which is about 4.11% of the city's overall land area. A lot of that land area was adjacent to the lagoon, which is great. We have 3 parks, Banana River Park, Manatee Sanctuary Park, and Center Street Park that are on the lagoon. The city now uses an alternative called Cheetah Pro, which our contractor helped us to identify as a suitable alternative that could fit with our scale needs, costs, and things like that. And we also do manual removal as well. Black's Lawn Care and Pest Control is our contractor that does our herbicide work, and they are a Keep Brevard Beautiful Lagoon Friendly Lawn certified lawn care contractor, which we're very proud of for them. So the impacts of doing this, the good and the bad. So the city's alternative is non-glyphosate based. That's good. It is a reduction in environmental impacts, one less thing to worry about, so to speak. It is a reduction in legal vulnerability. So I think this is an important point to bring up when talking about glyphosate because perhaps even more so than its environmental impacts, its legal impacts can be profound. There are many, many, many court cases with glyphosate out there in the world worth billions of dollars. So this is one thing that we've wanted to remove ourselves from moving forward. And it's just an example, a lead by example situation that we can be proud of. So the bad, the city's non-glyphosate-based alternative is what we've seen, definitely not as effective, and Dave could speak to that later if you have more questions. It does require additional manual removal because it is not as effective, and it is much more costly to utilize. Dave, how much is it, like over twice?
Yeah, it's roughly about one and a half times the amount.
1.5 times the amount of glyphosate. So, and also, before the pandemic, the city used to utilize an inmate crew that would help us with a lot of labor. Our Public Works Services Department is really good at their job, but we are quite small. We have 10, 15 people, maybe.
Yes.
And the inmate team used to double that, essentially. So it was a lot of, we could send them to do things like gardening, weeding, manual removal like that. So that burden has now shifted back onto our own team. So not having glyphosate, this alternative not be as effective as glyphosate, we've kind of seen it, so we've had to make some crew changes with that and just kind of really keep on ourselves with the weed and stuff. And we've definitely gotten the calls from residents saying, hey, I noticed there's a little bit more weeds here and there. What's going on? So that is something we've had to deal with. So, in identifying our nutrient reductions and pollution controls and things like that, we are relatively small, and we try and go for what we can that has the biggest impact. And since we are so small, we've really transferred into things like upgrading our water treatment facility, reducing our air emissions, and then reducing our stormwater input. A lot of the city is paved, highly paved, sometimes 60 to 80% in places, which is like New York City levels of pavement. So we have a series of strategies that you could see here besides our glyphosate ban. We utilize the summer fertilizer ban. We do xeriscaping where we can on city facilities, so we don't use grass. We have a lot of our city facilities rocked, actually. We use B-mats at all of the city's stormwater ponds. We have 5 of those. We've been really utilizing permeable pavement and asphalts so that we can directly infiltrate stormwater where it falls. Because the city is so paved, we're in the process of essentially trying to depave the city where we can. So, because the soil where the city is actually really good. The water just can't get to it. It's paved over. So before it gets to the lagoon, we try and get it back into the ground immediately. And to that end, we've also been installing stormwater exfiltration systems, which you can see an example of there with the orange tanks. These are underground tanks that capture stormwater as opposed to a traditional retention pond, and they are perforated on the bottom so the water goes right back into the soil. We have about 1 million gallons worth of storage capacity with these tank systems, and we can also divert reclaimed water from our treatment plants as opposed to directly discharging it into the lagoon, giving it more time to be cleansed through the soil. We have baffle boxes, of course, and then, as I said, with our air emissions, we're really trying to move forward with fleet electrification as well as offsetting our electricity usage with rooftop solar arrays. We're up to 2 solar arrays. We just activated one in May. We're up to about 67 tons of CO2 emissions abated with both systems, and we have a 3rd one coming online next year. So that's pretty much all I got. If anybody has any questions, I guess, I don't know if we're doing questions now or we're going to let everybody go first. Okay. So thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Do questions now or wait till the end for the committee?
It's up to the committee, but we thought if you want to, some questions may be answered as you move through the other panelists.
Yeah, let's just hold those to the end. If you can just jot them down, and let's get through everyone, and then we can target the questions to each individual as we get through.
Thank you, guys. It's nice to be here again. It's been a while. And I have missed these meetings very much, but the city of Satellite Beach passed our resolution in 2018. We are very similar to Cape Canaveral in terms of size. We're 11,300, I think, right now, and we have 23 employees in Public Works. We have 17 beach accesses, just like Cape Canaveral. Every time they were going down the list of Cape Canaveral, I was like, that's just like Satellite Beach. But we do have we're different in that we don't have a lot of access to the river in terms of public access. We have a lot of canals, but public access is pretty limited. We do have Sampson's Island, which is a great public asset that we provide boat tours to and boat access to. But that's pretty much the only park that we have in the river. Everything else is on the beach. We do have a number of ponds throughout the city. And when we began the effort to step away from glyphosate, it took the staff about a year to come up with the plan of how we were going to do that, because it is significant, a lot of work. There's a lot of benefits to doing that, but there's quite a bit of, it's costly. There's a lot of costs and effort that go into that. So I'm going to turn it over to Johnny and Kyle so they can explain from their perspective. They're the ones that do this every day. They got all the certifications and all the stuff they use. So I'm going to turn it over to them.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. As she said, I am Kyle. This is my supervisor, John. And yeah, at the City of Satellite, we have eliminated the use of anything glyphosate-based, such as Roundup, Prosecutor. And our job at Public Works is to build and maintain all of our city properties, parks, sports fields for the enjoyment of everyone, including the safety of everyone there and the environment. So that's really important to us. Replacing glyphosate, there's a couple different ways that we've gone about it. The mechanical way to remove it, it just increases labor costs. Adding more time in each location maintained usually just entails a lot of line eating, weed eating. And moving away from glyphosate increases the man hours or woman hours. Every 1 hour of spraying glyphosate is about 3 hours worth of weed eating, or 3 times, like 3 separate instances of spraying with something else. Not as effective, and it comes back a lot more frequently. Spraying glyphosate has a lasting effect of approximately 90 days, whereas the line trimming will need to be done probably every 14 if we let it really go on the back end. We have a surface area of 4.286 square miles, and of that we maintain roughly 85 3/4 acres of fence lines, turf grass, plant beds, and city properties, plus about 17,800 linear feet of swales and ditches. And in replacing it on the chemical end, finding a solution to our past usage required multiple other products. You can't just find, we haven't at least found just one out there that really works. Prosecutor Pro, for example, with the increased costs is about $100 per a 2.5 gallon jug of concentrate, which in a mixture that breaks down to about $1 per gallon of actual mix. On the the non-selective solution side, moving away from it and finding other products like Spectracide Extended Control, has a much lower efficacy, and at the higher cost end, it's $23 for a 40 fluid ounce bottle of concentrate, and that translates to about $5.80 per gallon of mix. So it's almost 6 times the amount of cost just in the bottle itself.
Salt, $8 a gallon.
Oh, yes, and we did find, we haven't experimented with it yet, but there is an all-natural solution. I forget what the product was called, but really it's sea salt based, and everything in there is all natural. But that per bag was $8, and 1 bag makes 1 gallon. So good product. Well, we don't know the efficacy of it yet, but it's a nice sounding product, but again, the cost is just astronomical. And there are selective herbicide solutions. Now, those will only target certain pests, certain weeds. It's not going to blanket everything. For blindside, for example, that's broadleaf weeds, stuff like your sedges and I'm blanking. Dollarweed. And that's $277 for an 8-ounce bottle. And Mansion, all these other selectives, $90 for an 8-ounce bottle. Sedgehammer, $133 for a 1.33 ounce bottle. So you're looking at like $100 an ounce. For our aquatic treatment on the chemical end, we don't really mess with any of the aquatic stuff. That is a licensure that I don't have. I don't think anyone has. So we rely on Solitude Lake Management. And we have also requested, and they don't spray any sort of glyphosate-based products. The alternatives that they use again, not as effective. They kind of just burn the torpedo grass and stuff on the side. So you get a nice browning effect, but nothing ever really actually goes away. So on the other side of that, with mechanical, we have what's called a we-do, and you can see me up on it looking majestic as ever. As much as I love to play around on that thing, it is very time-consuming for what we do. It's great to cut up the hydrilla, scoop it out, get the cattails off the bank, stuff like that. But the growth in the summertime being highly accelerated with warm water temps and the residual nutrients that come through the stormwater system, it's kind of difficult to keep up on with everything else that Public Works does on top of this sort of thing. So the drawbacks to the mechanical side is mainly fragmentation. If you cut up some hydrilla and there's any little bit left in there, you're going to have more plants. You're going to have more infestation. And there's zero way to get 100% of everything out of there. So the cut cattails as opposed to sprayed, all the rest of the weeds, they just come back with a vengeance. And Satellite Beach, we have 6 major stormwater ponds. Each one takes about a day between setup, breakdown, and clearing everything out of there with a backhoe and dump truck. And there's a lot of moving parts that go into it. It's not just the we-do itself. So really just in summary, based on our research or our trial and error, in our opinion, the alternatives to glyphosate just aren't as effective. And the results aren't really as desirable, and we have to keep coming back to the same spots over and over and over again a lot more frequently than we normally would. And yeah, so I'll take it to you.
And so, just from a cost perspective in the city's budget, since we stopped using glyphosate, the plan was to add what we call the grounds crew in Public Works to add a staff member a year. So we've added 4 so far. So that's an added, it's approximately about $260,000 a year. And that, of course, will go up every time we have healthcare costs or pension costs or raises. And we still don't have enough people in Public Works. We could easily, they requested 3, they got 1 this year. But yeah, they're still very grateful. But they could use the 3. They're not going to ask for things they don't need. So that's just something that people or communities have to keep in mind. That is an added cost. But I think just the benefit to the community has been just the perception of the public. Leading by example. We do a lot of xeriscape on our public properties. We have the tree forest in front of City Hall now that's very visible. And a lot of people point to that as an example. So I think, part of the larger sustainability, leading by example, that's probably the most important part of ending glyphosate. But other than that, I think people just need to understand how difficult it is for local governments to move from your entire operations are based on this very effective, very cost-effective chemical, and then to have to stop that. It's just a lot of time and money that goes along with that. So, thank you.
If I could add on the back end, I think one of the biggest things is just am I on? That thing's on. Is just changing the view when you look at a landscape. If we could get people to be more on board with, okay, this is kind of a natural area and whatnot like that. Okay, it's not as manicured, but it serves a purpose. It serves a point. And yeah, we're trying our best to lead by that example and also maintain those areas where we don't even have spray involved, but hedge trimmers and whatnot like that. So it's all maintenance. It's just a different kind of maintenance. So just thought I'd add a little bit of that. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sandy Reller. I work for the City of Titusville. I'm the Public Works Operations Director. So we're a little bit bigger than the last two. We have about 34 square miles, close to 50,000 residents, and 30 miles of ditches, and unlike the one that I heard. We have 13 wet ponds, about 200 miles of streets, 22 city-owned facilities, and luckily, we have a nice interlocal agreement with the county, and they maintain the high majority of our parks. We only have to maintain 2, which is why 13 wet ponds is not a lot for a city of our size. So that's kind of how we've been able to keep up with it. I started about 10 years ago in about 2 days. And during that time, they had an aquatic spraying contract. At every wet pond, they sprayed every visit, no matter what. You go to the pond looks clear, they're still spraying. So when I had the opportunity, when that contract came up, I decided, hey, let's leave it up to the contractor. If the pond doesn't need to be sprayed, don't spray it. They save hopefully some chemicals, so they became responsible for their means and methods. That didn't end up working. They sprayed anytime anyways, no matter what. So we built a pond, Dre Field, finished about the end of 2017. We decided, we're not going to use any herbicides, any chemicals in this pond. It had all sorts of, wetland treatment, everything. Within 2 years, hydrilla, everything took over that pond. You can see the aerial from about 2020. Nature had taken over. So we decided, hey, let's try to harvest it. So we came to you guys. We got funding. I think we were one of the first ones to do the mechanical harvesting. But that final project cost was $115,000 for one harvesting of one pond that can grow back in 3 months. So we realized that's not really sustainable. As you can see by the third picture, we actually put in floating wetland islands, also sorrel money, and it's maintained pretty well since then, but that's because we bought a boat. We bought the same boat that he talked about. We decided purchasing the harvesting boat was actually less than the one mechanical harvesting that the contractor did at Dre Field. And at that same time, we actually canceled our aquatic spraying contract in those wet ponds. So we've been using this boat to kind of keep up. Luckily, like I said, 13 wet ponds isn't a lot for a city of our size. So this boat does a great job, but like he said, it comes right back. So I mean, we have a person who is the boat guy. He's on the boat. He's constantly on the boat. You can't get it all. But people love it. They have a lot of questions when you're out there on the boat. What are you doing? Some people think we scare the ducks, but the ducks come back. So it does a good job. Now there are some drawbacks in the winter time when the ponds aren't as high. We can't use the boat because you're going to hit the ground, things like that. So we have stopped using glyphosate in our ponds and ditches this year. We are using We are using a different herbicide on some of the fence lines. Unfortunately, we don't have, our weed eaters aren't the weed eaters you have at your house. They don't have lines on them. They have blades, and they will tear up a fence. So people don't like when we just let their fence lines overgrow. We've looked at alternatives like, maybe we could rock all the fence lines. But with 30 miles of ditches, that became expensive really quick. We have begun researching alternatives to glyphosate. But as the doctor said, you quickly realize that there's not a lot of research on some of this other stuff, and it might have a longer half-life. It might not be as effective, so you have to use more. So you quickly get into, hey, I could be using something just because it doesn't say glyphosate, but it could end up being worse. So I think there needs to be a lot more research. So we would like to do a pilot project of potential alternatives. We just haven't gotten through the research to figure out what those may be. So what we feel the major challenges are funding. As Courtney said, funding and staffing. If mechanical harvesting, it takes people. Instead of spraying ditch lines, mechanically removing them, lawnmowers, it takes people, it takes funding. The lack of research, like I said, about the alternatives, even the natural stuff. Have they researched, what effect that may have? And one of the biggest one is public perception. The ponds aren't going to look like Disney. People want their ponds to look like Disney, especially this way. They're not going to. These are just some actual quotes I've received in my personal email from when we started doing this. Like, if there's a chemical to kill it, and he says he can spray and kill it, why can't it be done? Here are pictures of the pond look like when it was being treated by contractors monthly. Therefore, I know it can be kept clear if it's sprayed like it's supposed to be sprayed. And I put littoral zones around one of them, and she said, can we just remove the plants in the littoral zone? It made things worse. So you have a lot, the people in this room, we get it. We know what we're trying to do, but the high majority of people out there, they don't understand why their pond can't be clear and blue, and why are there plants growing around it. And I think we need to start getting, educating more and getting that public to understand if we're going to be using the boat, that means there's going to be some aquatic vegetation growing in it for a little bit before I can get back to that pond. I can't keep it clear as clear as a chemical could. So that's about all I got.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Rebecca Thibert. I'm the assistant to the city manager for the city of Melbourne. So like my partners up here, let me just give you some comparison of size. So we are approximate a little bit over 51 square miles, 32,000 acres in size, with a population of 87,000. And I would just like to note this beautiful photo on the slide. This is our Sherwood water quality project that most of you, I think, came and visited a few years ago, but this was partially funded by Sorrel, so we thank you for your support of that project. So for the city of Melbourne, when we talk about aquatic vegetation, the use of glyphosate, we have two main areas where that's focused on. It's through our Parks and Recreation Department and then our Streets and Stormwater Division. So Parks and Rec maintains approximately 797 acres. That includes our golf courses, parks, ball fields, and then 21 different city facilities, including City Hall, the 2 police department buildings, our Public Works complex, 9 fire stations, and then our various recreation facilities. And this is a picture of our new greens at our golf course off of Lake Washington. So approximately 2 or 3 years ago, probably around the same time that Cape Canaveral and Satellite Beach made their changes, our city manager asked our staff to take a look at the use of glyphosate in our operations. And we just found, as the others have mentioned, the cost was prohibitive for us to stop the use. But our staff does try to use an alternative product whenever possible. So they do evaluate each scenario for what they can use. And if there's something else that they can use or manual labor, we are doing that. But unfortunately, with our operations, it really can't be eliminated in entirety at this time. So for our Streets and Stormwater Division, they maintain our ponds, ditches, rights of way in the city. So we have 23 miles of ditches and only 13 ponds. 13 is a lot, but this is our Autumn Woods Pond, which is beautiful. That one was funded by DEP. And then we do contract with a vendor for aquatic weed control spraying. So I like this picture right here. This is what we call the mosquito ditch, which, if you're familiar with Melbourne, is kind of around the Fountainhead neighborhood off of Sarno. But this is one that is being used with spraying. We did have a vendor come out a couple years ago to look at this particular ditch. This is one of the biggest ones that we maintain. As you can see, it's quite deep, to see if we would be a candidate for vegetative harvesting in this location. And as you can see, it would be very difficult to get a boat down in this location to try to control that. So we do use a contractor for this and other locations. They are licensed for commercial pesticide applications. They are all the locations are permitted through the FWC, and they follow the FDEP herbicide use guidelines. But just for comparison, I wanted to show you guys this photo. This is also of the Sherwood Water Quality Project. On the left, that photo was taken shortly after construction finished in June of 2021. And then if you see over in the right, that photo with that vegetation that had started growing, that was only taken less than 3 months after, September of 2021. So this was prior to when the vendor was obtaining the permit from FWC to start the spraying process. But that's how much vegetation grew in just short 3-month time. For us in Melbourne, especially in this location that is in the middle of a neighborhood kind of, it's very aesthetic driven, customer or citizen inquiry driven. We get comments from the neighbors. Why is the ditch overgrown? Why is the pond behind my house overgrown? There's an expectation of our citizens for the way that they want the community to look, and that drives a large part of this maintenance. We also find that the residents are very cognizant of the vegetation that grows above the water. They don't want to see that. So while we deal with the hydrilla and all the other things, this is a location where a baffle box is, and we don't want the hydrilla in the box. The residents don't want to see the vegetation above the water. And so that's one of, when we're spraying, that's one of the things that we're looking for, is for that aesthetic purpose for the residents, because they like the way the city looks. So that's all I have.
Hi, Raleigh Berry with Department of Natural Resources Management. Nice to be back. I spoke to during the last meeting. And I'm going to try to discuss the county's managed lands and use of glyphosate. We're a big county, and we have lots of moving parts. Sorry. Is that better? Does that move? Oh, it even moves. So Brevard County has a total area of about 1,500 square miles, of which about 1,000 is land and about 500 is water back. The important thing on this slide, in my opinion, is we measure 72 miles from north to south. And the reason I mention that is when you are doing any sort of land maintenance, the transit time from location to location is something that's very important. And if we are moving from, say, the north of the county to the south of the county and back again in a day's time, that's 2 hours of our day gone, 2 hours of staff time just in transit. Brevard County has a population of 600,000 or so. Next. Now, this is going to be an overview of the different departments in the county who maintain lands. Public Works, or as you might think of it, Road and Bridge, maintains 419 miles of drainage ditches, 527 miles of drainage swales, and 82 stormwater ponds. Mosquito control manages 42,000 acres of marshlands. Okay. Parks and Recreation has 117 parks, 3 campgrounds, 6 nature and education centers, 78 beach access sites, 10 school athletic sites, and the Environmentally Endangered Lands Program, which is part of Parks and Recreation, manages 16,500 acres of sanctuaries and conservation areas. My department, which includes stormwater management, has 16 wetland restoration and conservation sites that cover 215 acres. We have 461 baffle boxes and curbside inlet baskets, 24 stormwater ponds under our management, and we also are involved in the management of 27 other ponds and lakes to date, and that's sites where we are engaged in aquatic harvesting, say for Parks and Recreation or for Road and Bridge. Couple of notes on glyphosate use. Public Works has imposed a moratorium in-house of a half-a-mile buffer around the Indian River Lagoon where they are not using any herbicides at all. Mosquito control looked into it, and they are using, and it's amazing that it's this little, between 5 and 10 gallons of glyphosate in all of their managed lands annually. And the reason that they use herbicides for mosquito control is because floating and emergent vegetation it serves as a breeding ground for mosquitoes, and so they have a public health responsibility to address that concern. Okay, now, here's where I know what I'm talking about. We have in our under management 101 acres of uplands, 215 acres of wetlands, and 241 acres of ponds or lakes. And my department, fiscal year to date, has used 5.46 gallons of glyphosate. That's 0.009 gallons per acre. And when I report this, keep in mind that a concentrated glyphosate is typically something like 53.8% when you buy it. It's a concentrate. There's some, surfactants and water mixed into it. So I've converted my numbers into pure glyphosate. All right. Okay. So we're not using very much glyphosate in the county. That's one point. Are there any alternatives? And the doctor touched on this, and others have touched on this. I'll also go into it a little bit. There are about a dozen herbicides that are permitted for use in aquatic locations. Of those, there are about 7 that are used for emergent and floating vegetation. The rest of them are used for vegetation in the water column, i.e. hydrilla. And all of them that are available for use in aquatic locations have concerns. I've noted the lethal concentration 50 for fish here, and you can see that some are more lethal than others. The herbicide that was mentioned earlier that's causing the browning, immediate browning along the shorelines, that was probably diquat. Diquat is a contact herbicide. It is of no use in the water column, but it causes pretty instant browning of any plant tissue that it touches. I won't let my staff, all of whom are licensed applicators, to use diquat because it is particularly nasty. It can be corrosive to metals. It's, in my opinion, the most dangerous of the products that could be used. Next. So let's go on to a cost analysis. And the cost analysis here is an actual example from a recently harvested site on Merritt Island. It's a pond that's about 13 acres in total size, and along one shoreline we had cattails growing in a swath about 6 feet wide, the entire length. Okay, go on. So, if this were to be sprayed by using glyphosate, and I know this from practical experience because years ago, I would get in a little John boat with a little sprayer, and I would put along this shoreline spraying glyphosate on the cattails. If we were to do this, using staff and being safe and having 2 staff members on site in case there's a problem, it would involve about 4 hours of staff time, including transit. We would spend about $25 in fuel, and the cost of the employees during that time would be around $200, and the cost of the herbicide would be about $150, including surfactant. So to do that job would cost the county $375, more or less. But we didn't do that. What we did was we harvested using our WeDo, which has been mentioned. 2 employees, took them 15 days at 8 hours a day, some of which was transit. That involved 3 different types of fuel because we had 3 different kinds. We had 300, let me back up. We used 3 pieces of equipment, each of which used fuel at a different rate per hour. So I calculated that. The bottom line is it costs about $16,000 to remove the cattails at that location. It's a significant cost difference there. We're not doing this because we're trying to avoid the use of glyphosate. We are doing this to remove nutrients from the system by harvesting the vegetation, and that's what makes it justifiable in our opinion. So, if you want to go down the route of harvesting, and mind you, harvesting is only applicable in certain locations, ponds, lakes, canals if they are wide enough, but little drainage ditches here and there, and around buildings and around baffle boxes and things, you're not going to be able to use equipment. But if you want to harvest in the sites where you can, I would recommend that you get 2 flatbed dump trucks. That's going to run $260,000. A workboat, $110,000. Now they're a little bit more expensive than 2 years ago. A track hoe, an excavator at $115,000. A skid steer at $65,000. 2 trailers, one for the skid steer and one for the track hoe at $40,000. You'll need a pickup truck to transport your staff, and then there are some specialized aquatic vegetation harvesting attachments that should run you around $50,000. Total startup cost to have a program that can handle a couple of dozen ponds or so should be around $690,000 plus the cost of 3 full-time employees plus a suitable base of operations. So it's expensive. And I think that's it.
Okay, so first I would like to thank all of our local governments for participating in the panel. I think it's very helpful to hear about the day-to-day experiences of some of these challenges. And so with that, I will open it up to the committee for any questions or discussion. Lorraine has been patiently waiting. So.
Yeah, this is a different question, but I wanted to ask Zach about the success with BMATs, and then I didn't hear any other municipality talk about using BMATs, so I'd like to know why.
This thing is cool. I like this. We found them to be pretty successful. I definitely wouldn't say their use is saving the lagoon as a whole, but we only have 3 ponds with 5 mats. We have a contractor that comes and maintains them. They are the contractor is the entity that designed them in the first place. I believe their name is simply also BMATs. They remove, I've seen the annual reports, a few dozen pounds of nutrients a year, nothing crazy. And in terms of phosphorus, it was really like 2 or 3 pounds cumulatively. They get harvested every few months, 6 months, Dave, is that? Or?
I think it's every 6 months.
Yeah, every 6 months they get harvested, replanted with Florida natives. They grow hydroponically. The roots help cleanse the water. Great education piece. We could talk about what they are. People like them. Birds love them. So yeah, that's kind of a simple story.
We have them in 9 of our ponds. Most of our wet ponds have them, and we've actually found, we started I think Senior Center, they've been in 6, 7 years now, and I don't have to mechanically harvest that pond anymore. It takes a while, but I think they do a very good job. It's not going to be instant, and you'll notice a difference between a pond that gets a lot of nutrient inputs and a pond that does not. You'll see a lot more growth in some of those ponds, and we've had up to 500 pounds of nitrogen removed in one harvesting. So I think they're very useful, especially when you have your high input areas. I have one over in one little marina park that gets very little input, and it doesn't do a lot, but the higher nutrient inputs, I think it does a great job.
That's actually a really good point. So our BMATs are not, the ponds that they're in are not adjacent to highly urban areas. One is within a park, and one is at our water treatment plant. So that's a good distinction.
Okay, can I just make one comment? Because I brought it up because the experience with the city of Cocoa and the BMATs that have been applied, not only have they been economically reasonable, but over time we're seeing less vegetation. And we've taken algae-crusted ponds that were next to residences, and they're, basically lakefront property now.
Laura?
I have a question for Zach. So last month I saw, I think it was your city manager, and he did a presentation to the Cocoa Beach Hotel Motel Association about your streetscaping plans. You're going to make your streets one way and narrow them and plant trees along the sides, and it just looked wonderful. And then run one street east one way, and then the next one goes the other way. So you're changing your traffic pattern, but you're narrowing your streets, and then you're planting trees along the sides. How are you funding that?
I'd start with the caveat of maybe. That's a good way to put it. It's a vision. So what she's referring to is something called the Presidential Streets Master Plan, which our council passed in December of 2022. And the Presidential Streets Master Plan takes an area of the city called the Presidential Streets, older area, highly residential, and the streets are suffering from age, cracked. There's chronic flooding in the summer nowadays. Highly paved, as I was talking about earlier. This is where we see sections of the city that are 60, 70, 80% paved. So literally just from one condo over to the next is just a concrete valley. So we have, in the concept phase, plans to systematically redo a pair of streets within this network every year. And we would be funding it just through the city's general fund and through grants. The scope or the plan that was developed by Kimley Horn and Associates was nice enough to identify up to 70 grants that we can go after for an applicable project. That was part of their scope. So, hey, teach us how to pay for this kind of thing. But yes, one of the design's recommendations was to one-way some of the streets. For the simple purpose of that, one of the lanes could be removed. It's pavement or converted to, say, permeable pavement, which maybe can't take the weight as much as normal concrete, for a bike trail or a pedway or something like that, and then implant tree boxes, bioswales, rain gardens, things of that nature. Because, we're trying to do as much as we can, but we're limited to what we can do within what we own, and we own the street. So that is what we're trying to do in that sense. And we've been working with a lot of our hoteliers too. I'm sure a lot of you know Cape Canaveral has a lot of hotels. Unfortunately, they've been playing ball game with us. We have a site plan for a new hotel that started construction soon, and about a third of their parking spaces will be permeable. And I was like, oh my God, they listened to us. And we have another permeable parking lot for cruise parking at the north end of the city that we worked with that developer, and we believe it's the largest permeable parking lot in the state. It's about 3 acres in size. And you look at it, it looks like Rice Krispie Street, and water goes right through it. He had severe flooding on the site. He was actually going to use all concrete, and it was just flooding. So, he switched it over with some of our guidance, and it doesn't flood. And the water goes right into the ground where it is. So, yeah, that's kind of the story of the Presidential Streets. That's a 25-year plan. So, if I'm still here 25 years from now telling you how it goes, I'll let you know. But we have the first set of streets set for design work in the next fiscal year. And the following fiscal year is when we start construction on the first 2 identified. Probably 2 that experienced the most flooding.
Just a quick follow-up question on particularly your permeable pavement on private developments. Do you have any sort of enforceable obligations for maintenance on those? Because the permeable pavement can be really suspect over time without maintenance to get to clogging and things of that nature. So can you address?
Yes, absolutely. We warn people pretty explicitly, like, this is not a solution that goes in and you forget about it. Permeable pavement definitely requires maintenance fairly regularly too, especially depending on its location. For a beachside community where there's sand everywhere, it can clog up pretty fast. But there's a lot of systems in place that can clean it, but that is an additional cost, right? Everything is about the knock-on effect of what it is better in one regard, but in another sense, it may make things harder. So, when we start initiating the Presidential Streets Master Plan, maintenance of those types of installations will definitely have to be considered in the pricing. You can buy a vacuum truck that's specific to cleaning permeable pavement, but we looked at one, it was maybe the size of a very large golf cart with essentially a suction device on the front. Very fun to drive, very cool looking. It was $250,000, Now, when you knock on those effects of how much nutrients does that remove from the lagoon, ecosystem services restoration, externalities, yeah, that could probably be justifiable, but it's a hard pill to swallow at first. So yeah, contract, the gentleman that, the developer who has the cruise parking with the permeable pavement, he has a maintenance plan in place where he has a vac truck come and cleans it out. So it's definitely something to consider when you're doing it.
In Titusville, we recently, last couple of years, have an LID ordinance. It's not mandatory, but they do get incentives on their site plan if they smaller parking areas, things like that. So we've actually had a lot of people, more than I thought, take advantage of it. And we require them as part of their site plan to make a maintenance plan, sign an agreement, and then if they don't follow that maintenance plan, they'll be in violation of their site plan, and we can get code enforcement involved.
Perfect.
It's necessary. We recently found a couple years ago, somebody just paved over their pervious parking, and it's like, yeah, you can't do that. So we've recently implemented it. We actually our first maintenance covenants came through a couple months ago to council, so we've started doing that, and that way it's violation of their site plan if they don't follow it.
Excellent. Bobby, I think Bobby was already.
I'll just ask about bitmaps first, and then I'll let it go back around. I forgot, Zach, I just kind of, how often do you harvest the bitmaps, you said again?
About every 6 months.
6 months, okay. And I don't know, maybe this one's for Virginia. I've been wondering about it, probably a good time to ask. There's a park up in North Merritt Island, Kings Park, I think. There's a trail. And if you look through some of the vegetation on the one part of the trail, you can see, is that what's out there in this one pond? There's a series of big floating mats.
Kings Park? Yeah. They're at Lake George. Are they also in Kings Lake? Yes.
Okay, Charlie?
One of the things I heard during the presentation is there's a lot of alternatives out there that are being tried. And I spoke with the zoo, and they also have banned glyphosates. And they've tried a couple different items too. One was called burnout. And one of the chemicals you guys talked about had a burn in the name, but it's clove oil, citric acid. But it only works where the plants are exposed to direct sunlight. But they also use something that sounds like a lot of fun with a blowtorch in different areas around sidewalks yeah, so it's one of the alternatives. But it kind of reminded me during the shuttle program when we were trying to get rid of trichloroethane, which it damaged the ozone layer. So we made an effort, and we cleaned it for everything on the solid rocket boosters, and we could never come up with one alternative that worked in all the different applications and for all the different contaminants that had to be removed. So we came up with 2, 3, perhaps 4. And so, you had to be selective, like, oh, this one works good on these rings, and this works better on the aft skirt, whatever. So, that's one of the things I think as we go through these alternatives, maybe you got to use this one here and this one for this application or on a sunny day or a rainy day. But I really appreciate the work that everybody did to come up with the information that was presented. And it comes back to, as Zach started his presentation, about the toxicity from the human exposure, which may be really the greatest risk that we face. I think it's a class 2A carcinogen, glyphosate, if I'm correct, and someone else could, if you have different data, please speak up. So, we do have to watch out for the employee safety. I think that's the utmost thing we need to look at when we look at chemicals like this. So thanks again.
Thank you. Vinny?
Yeah, I wanted to thank all you guys for trying. I know, again, you probably get lots of calls of people that are like, this needs to be worked on, and we don't know until we try. I think all the presentations today was research, like Dr. Fox's was research, but I think what you all are doing is research as well. And so I think that's great. Keith Winston once said, like, it takes like a movement, but then it also takes market forces to make that actually sustainable. And so I think all the different options you guys are choosing or are using are different, have different marketable effects. But I think for me, it's we planned our way into this, and so it's like we have to plan our way out. Like it has to be a design process. And so one of the things that I like was people talking about using smaller parking lots. I think you said in Titusville, or there's credits that go to that. So I think it's just a planning process, not just a patching process. So. But that's awesome. Thank you guys for putting up with all the calls, and I'm sure you get people saying it looks terrible.
Others? Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, again, just with Vinny, I really appreciate those of you that have come here to speak to us, and, you know, we're also, you're not speaking to us, you're speaking to the public as well at large, and we're a rather dynamic county in size and scope, and although the community, we seem pretty similar from Brevard, but the reality is we're very similarly different. As you guys, just through your presentations, your testimonies are, I mean, the people you deal with are different cultures, you know, so perception is a lot, and obviously we have two beachside communities have very similar perceptions of what they think is okay, but yet you look at them, they're two very different looking communities, you know, and the residents have different views on what they believe and they want to see. As Melbourne, you were saying, right? Their viewpoint is different. I bet you if you go to Melbourne Village, which I don't think they'd ever need to be here, do they have any of these issues, right? But their residents have a very different opinion on what they expect to live around. So with that, again, thank you guys for coming here. I don't know, did we ask the Melbourne-Tillman District to come as well, or did they get involved?
I see the Melbourne-Tillman District out here, so.
Okay.
Maybe he can speak during public comment.
Yeah, because I know they might see different things because the scopes of the canal work that they've dealt with, and when I've talked and worked with them before, their perception on some of this impact before it was talked about was pretty significant. So it's, you know, like I wish Palm Bay was here because they have a project they did quite a while ago that they still never talk about, nobody knows about, and it was doing this before people thought it was okay. And it didn't take them much, and it was for flood control first, but the impact for the Turkey Creek and the Lagoon has been very significant as well as very positive for the residents in that part of Palm Bay and at large. So they created, for flood control was the primary because the neighborhood was an older neighborhood and constantly would flood. And so they were going to do a basic retention pond. But in that instead, when they went to look, turns out there was a lot of large trees. And if you know that area of the county, they don't have many trees. So they decided they needed to keep some of these trees, like all of them they could. So the retention pond does not look like a retention pond. It looks almost natural where it goes around, there's peninsulas around the larger trees. So they were able to put in pavilions and benches and places people could utilize it and turned it into a park. Now there's a path around it. And it also leads to the other part, which was the Sterner parcel, I think called A's Trail now. A's Hammock Trail, I think? Yeah. And so that is one of the most, I think, compact biodiverse spots in our county because the scope from hardwood hammock to mangrove alone, I mean, you got some of the best examples of a few things like the wild rosemary. But they also just recreated instead of a canal or a ditch, they tiered it, they weired it to slow down the turbidity as well to catch all this stuff. And at first it cost them a few extra thousand, but in the long term, it saved a lot in how much they have to dredge out of the creek before it goes into the lagoon. So it was a preventative measure that also enhanced the community. And that's, I think, the examples of stuff we need to be putting out there. That people get this, it's not just an ecological, it is also a community enhancement project. And so with that, I have maybe two questions.
What was the name of that project?
Well, originally it was the Sterner parcel. It's behind, it's off of Palm Bay Road.
The Sterner.
Behind kind of the Catholic church, the old St. Joseph's Church. That's how you get access to the park, right there by the old cemetery. Yep. And I'll meet you out there anytime.
If it's properly noticed, you're both members of the committee, so please adhere to sunshine.
Thank you. Well, we could do a group tour. Yeah. So I have maybe two questions about, because again, like Vinny, you're saying, this is all sort of experimental, what you guys are doing as well. Have you seen in some of these places you've been doing this stuff, and is there a difference in places or the shorelines or the ponds that have a substantial, I'd say tree line, like a shaded shoreline area? Is there a difference in those areas for vegetation? issues? And is there any thoughts on those that feel they still need to use the glycophosphates for at least some amount? Maybe just time frame restrictions or time frames a year? Because I know, like, I mean, I'm from Grant, Valcaria, and when we incorporated, we didn't got a lot of money, but we're also kind of a little rural area, so there was a lot of things we weren't concerned about, right? So people weren't concerned necessarily on the main roadways if it's always mowed every week, every month even. Well, with that if you go along the Valcaria Road along the airport, the east side, you can see in times of the year where the natural grass grows up, and you get that like painted Indian grass, nice pink purple haze for almost a mile stretch. Yeah, and that was just coincidental of they didn't have money to mow, but turns out they didn't need to mow all the time. So little examples. Again, that's all I got. Thank you all for coming and sharing and updating with what you guys have been doing.
Okay, got a question.
Funding level from the trust fund to do floating vegetation mats. I hate to give Steve a plug every time, but and also maintenance.
So municipalities and HOAs can apply for stormwater funds. So depending on the location, we're going to discuss the cost share estimates for those in a minute. But the SORL funds do not apply for the maintenance. It's the installation only. So then this municipality or HOA would be responsible for the harvesting contract with the company.
And that maintenance responsibility is in the contract, that they will maintain the systems, right? You'll note all the contracts that are for receipt of SWIRL funds are for, initial costs. There has to be a long-term maintenance entity because the tax is for 10 years. And so, we don't want to spend the funding on projects that are going to be abandoned once the dollars aren't there.
Okay, any others? Just one thing to add, a couple observations from my perspective as well. One, I just very, again, appreciative of the local communities, but also proud of both this committee and the staff for teeing this up on what I think is a very effective discussion that, often becomes one-dimensional on what, as an example, an alternative to glyphosate, where what I heard a lot of today is, one, there's a lot of trade-off decisions to be made on cost. We heard earlier on that, we've got $330 million or so in dollars that we're spending, but yet we've got multiple partners that are also spending lots of dollars, and all of that, one way or another, comes from the community. So making sure we understand where the best dollars exist to get the best results, I think, is really important. And often these get addressed as individual items, and that is hard because they all interrelate. And so I think that's one role of this committee, is help draw those connections. The other piece that I want to highlight, though, too, that really struck me is that everything that I heard that was the most impactful solution really had to do with completely changing perspective on how we approach things and how we design. Because, as an example, the conversation I just heard about trimming, well, guess what? If we're trimming all the time to eliminate the glyphosate, then we are, our very first presentation said the eutrophication is probably the worst issue, and now we've got all of that natural vegetative matter sitting there waiting to go into the waterways. So some of these alternative solutions really have other implications, and that's where we've got to lean on this data and start thinking about how we really change perspectives, whether that's Florida natives, plants, and restructuring. I love that solution of, the one-way streets and changing the perspective of what communities look like in order to better partner with the environment. So just really wanted to highlight that, because I think for me that was the biggest theme I heard today, was that change in philosophy of how communities can live in harmony with the environment here. So. With that, we'll move on. I don't think we have any old business. We'll move over to new business, and we've got the 2024 plan update schedule. I think we're good.
Okay, so we're going to go over the proposed schedule for the rest of the year and the new plan update. So last week, the committee was sent this agenda packet. We are having the meeting today to discuss this, and our next item is to go over the cost share. So we plan on posting the approved cost share eligibility and link on the SORL funding applications by the end of the month. We're going to have that cycle open for about 2 months for applications to be accepted. We will review them for a month and then get that packet ready for the November Citizen Oversight Committee meeting. There is potential to cancel the December meeting. We will send the draft 2024 plan update to the Citizen Oversight Committee mid-December. We will discuss that at the January meeting on January 19th. The plan has to be posted for 15 days once approved by the Citizen Oversight Committee, and then it can go to the County Commission. We don't yet have the County Commission schedule for next year, so it will likely be on the 6th or the 13th that it goes to Commission for review.
Okay,
Any
thank
questions?
you. Any questions from the committee? And do you need a motion of support or anything on adopting this, or just kind of head nod?
I move to approve the proposed schedule as in the agenda.
Second.
Second.
Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Schedule passes unanimously. Your next item is cost share rates for the 2024 plan update.
Right, so typically what we do is we go back and we look at what projects are costing, and then we look at what that average is over the 10-year plan. This go-around, because inflation has been so significant recently, we went back and we applied a CPI to the project cost from the time that a project was added to the plan, and whatever the dollars were at that time, to when construction is actually anticipated. So there's usually a several-year lag between, when the initial funding is ready for design or whatever, and when a project is completed. And so we used inflation specific to the years between when a project was added to the plan or when it was initially funded in the plan versus when construction completion is anticipated. So there's a formula for each individual project for all 383 projects in the plan. And then after we had done that, we calculated the new average, and that's what you see in the right-hand column on the table as proposed for 2024. There are a few exceptions that are based on exceptions that have been approved by the County Commission in the past. So package plant connections, even after we did that CPI adjustment, the average cost for those was $1,459 per pound, but the board had previously said they'd pay $1,500 a pound for waste water type projects. So we're still proposing $1,500 per pound for that. Similarly, for septic system upgrades, the average cost on those is $924, but the board had previously approved up to $1,200 per pound for those. Then for stormwater projects, we looked at those at this committee's direction. the costs vary between the mainland, Merritt Island, and the beaches significantly. And so instead of just using an average county-wide cost for stormwater, those costs are analyzed by those regions. You'll notice that the beaches actually goes down even after we applied a CPI. The reason for that is there were some projects added to the plan last year as substitutions for some of the most expensive plans or projects that were stormwater projects that were previously in that basin in the plan. So the expensive projects went out, the substitute projects went in, and the net result is a decreased average cost for that particular row. And then for vegetation harvesting, we did this last year. We're proposing this again. We have two very, very large projects that are in the plan that, because of economies of scale, really drive this mean cost down. So those are the Melbourne-Tillman Water Water Control Districts project and the county-wide harvesting. And so if we exclude those from the calculation, then the average cost is $114 a pound. So that's the staff's calculation of what the 2024 cost share would be if we use the traditional method, but with applying CPI.
Okay, Laura.
What category does BMATs go under?
Stormwater projects.
Stormwater projects, okay, thank you.
Others?
Let me just add, while we're back on BMAT. So first of all, it was Lake George in Kings Park, not Kings Lake. And the county has added BMAT, floating islands, to many of our ponds where the loading is such that the pond size is only capable of removing so much of the load. And so adding BMATs, is a very quick, it doesn't require permits, it just requires, cash and a contract to get them in there, and instantly your pond is able to remove more nutrients than it did before. So it does come with a long-term maintenance cost. Some of our ponds, we are harvesting and replacing the vegetation twice a year, some of them 3 times a year, depending on how much nutrients are coming to that pond and what's most efficient for that pond. We have found that in some cases, you need to do a couple episodes of vegetation harvesting with the harvester to kind of get things in control and remove, a lot of the legacy load before the BMATs can keep up with the nutrient loading.
Sure.
But they're a great tool for sort of, instantly taking the water quality treatment ponds that we have and increasing their ability to reduce nutrients making it to the lagoon.
Okay, others? Just a quick observation too, based on what we heard today with how fast some of this material regrows on this vegetation harvesting category. I'd definitely encourage us to have conversations with the local governments and encourage, acquisition of equipment and things to be able to sustain those types of vegetation harvesting rather than any one-time activities, because it certainly seems that that's going to have limited sustainable productivity. So. If there is no other discussion, I will accept the motion. Stephanie?
I move that we approve the recommended cost share rate from the county.
Do I have a second?
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
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 All opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Okay, and that brings us to general public comments. I only have one card here. Do we have some others? If anyone else has a card, please go ahead and fill that out. Sandra Sullivan. And as a reminder, we will have 3 minutes for your comments.
Sandra Sullivan, South Patrick Shores. Really appreciated your comments, pretty amazing. And to Dr. Fox, I so appreciate the work that he has done and how enlightening that was. As we know, the problem is, the lagoon, this is a foundation species. We've lost 96% of seagrass. This is where I live in South Patrick Shores. I've come here before and showed this. This is the truck spraying Aquastar, which is 58% glyphosate in the ditches that drain directly to the lagoon. This drains directly to the lagoon. So when you're talking about prioritizing the glyphosate usage, I would say to prioritize where it drains to the lagoon, right? So that's in the lagoon plan. That's our loss of seagrass, and it starts in 2011. This is where I live. Comparing it, Pineda, look at the difference. Look what happens in 2011. I mean, what changed? The muck didn't change. The septic systems didn't change. The sewage systems didn't change. Something changed, right? So now we have a better understanding why. So the problem is the state impact, right? So the state in 2010 made the decision to switch to broadcast spraying of herbicides. And so there's a lot of intergovernmental coordination that needs to happen to stop the spraying where it drains to the lagoon. The second one is there's a state statute that prohibits banning herbicides. So even if local government wanted to say, like the fertilizer ban, have a ban on herbicides, you can't do it. So we need intergovernmental coordination. I wanted to talk about another thing too. So in the Save Lagoon, it says the role of the oversight will be to look at actual and updated project costs and timeliness of project delivery. So that's in the ordinance. I just want to mention that per the lagoon plan, Grand Canal is not in the top 20 flux sites. We're supposed to be done in 4 years on Grand Canal. It's 55% complete, 18 million. Did records requests for the clerk of courts on that. So I just want to talk about the new project, Sally Beach. This was presented, this is the paperwork, presented to this body for $8.2 million. That was signed January 2023. In February, it went to the state, and it was for 18 million, not 8, 18 million. They went and asked for a 50-50 split of $9 million. So I'm going to make a request that these two projects come back with actual performance and actual numbers and be reevaluated. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments. I have one more card, Rick Nipper.
Do I push this button?
Yeah, it's the green button over
The
there. It's
green
on.
button.
The light's on.
Well, I mean for the time.
I got it.
You got it? Okay.
Oh,
All right.
yeah.
Thanks. You're all right. All right. My name is Rick Nipper. I'm the district manager, newly district manager for the last 5 months for the Water Management Control District, Melbourne Tillman. I know a question came up earlier about a perspective on the glyphosate. Yes, we use glyphosate. We have 100 miles of canals that we manage. The district was formed in 1922. It used to just all go to Indian River with no backup. It just went in to keep flooding from happening. Since then, St. John's has partnered with the district, and this is before my time, obviously. They put a control structure in it to raise that amount to push out to the west, and it pumps a lot of water out there to do that. But to manage our flooding, glyphosate is an important part of that. What we did do, and thank you for this committee to giving us a nice grant that our UCF grad engineer was able to get that from, and we won't hold that against him, but to get a grant to be able to manually pull that out, because we recognize too that use of glyphosate, while it is relatively safe, still does cause the nutrient loading and the muck and all those things that go with that to eventually go over that control structure or out west, which is a lot of cleanup out there that can take place. So yeah, we use it, and yes, we've reduced it over the years. I know that too. I would love nothing more than to see us eliminate and be able to pull that out, but we do have a limited, we just capped out, as a matter of fact. On our rates, we have no more increases. We haven't had an increase since 1989, I think it was. And that's really entirely up to our legislative delegation to be able to get that up, and if we could use some help on that, to be able to increase that, I would love nothing more than to be able to move away from that and to manage our canals appropriately to, one, flood control is our number one priority above all else. Secondly, I'd like to be moving away from that, get more mechanical, but we only have 20 people for that 100 miles of management, and that's cutting grass, that's weeds, that's mechanics, that's heavy equipment. For instance, one canal we just spent 6 weeks on just to clean that to make sure we don't have flooding in the North Melbourne part. And it takes time, and with a 4-person crew on that, there's not a whole lot we can do. So I did want to share that. I got 40 seconds if anybody has a quick question.
So that sounds like a good job for our legislative delegation. We were doing a presentation out at Blue Origin last week, and the question came up from a homeowner that as we divert this water to the west, that historically it didn't go to the lagoon, but then it did, but now it's going back west again. Is that going to cause flooding further upstream, like in Astor, or will State Road 46 be underwater longer if we have another hurricane? What's the impacts of all that additional water going into the St. John's Basin?
Well, what little bit I do know, because again, I'm new to this job, but we do lower the structure. When there's a storm or something comes in, heavy rains, we have the ability to lower that structure, and more water will go into the inner river because a flood is not flooding is our primary concern. There are also safeguards that if it's flooding that way, there's gates to open up to come back into the canal, so it's not flooding out that way. So St. John's has really done a lot of homework and thought process to this whole thing.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
So, and any of those rediversion projects require permits from the state, and the state looks at both the rate, the peak rate and the total volume of flow, and make sure that the project is designed in such a way that it's not going to increase, you're not trading off, we're saving these people from flooding by shifting the water over here and flooding those people. So they do that by looking at peak rates and volumes in the engineering calculations.
Okay, and then I have an item, just, I'm still learning this process. And so I did not open up for public comment on our new business items, the schedule and the cost share. So I want to just take a step back and ask if there's any public comment on either one of those. If there is, I'll revisit the vote. But if there's no comment, then we'll stay with the original vote. Okay.
Sandra Sullivan, South Patrick Shores. So given that the cost for mechanical harvesting is $114 per pound compared to, say, muck, which is, what was it now, 600 and, I have it somewhere here, 600 and something, would it make sense to prioritize that more? And the reason I'm saying is, I moved up here from South Florida, and my son was at FAU at 12 years old. He's a genius, doing environmental courses and stuff at FAU. And so part of that, he took a course on essentially STAs, stormwater treatment areas, where they use periphyton, which is essentially what you were describing for that project, Sterner Parcel. The idea is to catch the fresh water before it goes into the tributary, treat it in areas, and then you use, because the plants are so good at uptake of nutrient loading, you use that to get that nutrient loading out. You can get that, also give it a chance in areas to percolate and stop those freshwater impacts into the tributary. And so this is really tried and true science, and it would really make sense if that budget for mechanical harvesting and combine that with what you were talking about with the Crane Creek is a great direction, because that's exactly what that is what they're doing down in South Florida with these very tried and true science with stormwater treatment areas. So I just would like this board to consider, with, given that it's so much cheaper and what we're learning about glyphosate, that you really consider maybe some shifting of dollars to put a more percentage to the lower cost. Thank you.
Okay, and with that, I had already had a motion second. I inadvertently took that vote. I'll ask the committee to consider that public comment, and we'll, first of all, open up if there's any additional discussion based on that public comment.
From what I just heard, this goes more toward prioritizing where we're spending the money, not on the cost share. And so I don't have any problem with maintaining what we did before.
And I do agree with that interpretation. That's more, that discussion would come into play with our application of these and evaluation of the projects. So with that, since we have had that public comment, I'll once again ask for then a vote. So all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Passes unanimously. Thank you, and apologize for that point of order issue. So that, I will now open up to final comments from the committee.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
I just wanted to thank the committee and the staff for accommodating my needs today. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Okay, Laura Lee.
So I have some happy seagrass news. When I had my surgery, I wasn't able to water test for 6 months. So last Saturday, I went out. It was the first time I was able to do my water testing since Christmas. And, you know, I'm testing in Mosquito Lagoon, but I always go over to the Indian River Lagoon side, north of Haulover Canal, and stop at the different ends of the dirt roads and look, praying to see seagrass rhizomes. And I haven't seen any since like 2016. Well, on Saturday, I saw seagrass rhizomes mixed in with the grassal area that's piled up on the west side of the Indian River Lagoon, north of Haulover Canal. I mean, there was some big rhizomes, big stargrass and haliduli. It was wonderful. And I was so happy. And then I got home, late that afternoon, I got an email from Lori Morris, who's the seagrass lady for St. Johns River Water Management District. And she sent me a video. Virginia, did I send that to you?
Somebody did.
Okay, so, okay, I can send it to you. It needs to go out to the committee members, because what they're seeing in Mosquito Lagoon, and it's like the same thing I saw 3 summers ago when the rhizomes first started showing up on the west shore of the Mosquito Lagoon, just little tiny rhizomes. And I think we harvested 2 5-gallon buckets of rhizomes that summer to send over to Sea and Shoreline. Well, the next summer, there was more rhizomes, and we harvested 8 5-gallon buckets of seagrass pieces to send to Sea and Shoreline. Last summer, we harvested 120, and the zoo was getting buckets too. So starting from those first little rhizomes to the Mosquito Lagoon is carpeted with seagrass now. It looks like it did when I was fishing in it in the 1970s. I mean, it's incredible. And so I'm hoping that cycle is starting now in the northern Indian River Lagoon too. We're seeing little sprigs of haliduli and stargrass over on the east side of the Indian River, across the river from Titusville. Still not seeing anything along the Titusville shoreline, but it is starting to grow across the river. So the northern end of the Indian River Lagoon has the least water circulation, and it gets the most impact from fresh water and nutrients and stuff that's going in. So, and I'm hearing reports all up and down the lagoon of seeing seagrass coming back. So I think that, you know, it's been 5 years now, the work that this committee is doing, the work, you know, that citizens of Brevard County voted for and believed in, it's really starting to show. And my other comment is that we've had a lot of rain recently, and the water in the river is still clear. I mean, you can still see the bottom by Titusville even. It's incredible. So I think that, you know, we're on the right path, and the investment is starting to pay off big time. Thank you.
Kurt?
Just to follow up with what you said, Laura Lee, in front of my house, I have a lot of clerpa, so I have to get a mask on and get down there and see if there's any seagrass coming up. But to your point about rain and et cetera, it's amazing. I've noticed for probably the last 3 months, maybe 4, when we get a rainstorm or a wind event, typically in front of my house would be cloudy for days, sometimes weeks. And now, the next day, you can still see the bottom. And there, probably only a year or 2 ago, I thought I'm never going to see the bottom at my dock again because it was just covered with silt. Now it's nice and white and sandy. So we're making progress.
Excellent.
Virginia, you mentioned earlier the water temperature, and obviously we've got our historically hot temperatures going around, and we're in July. So I know with all the good news that we see with the seagrass, that's great. I just wanted to, I didn't know if there was any preparation or anything looking forward into August as far as the dissolved oxygen going even lower and being prepared in case there are any spotted, fish kills for us to be able to work. I think last time we worked with KBB to get that out, just again to take out any nitrogen that we see in the system, and just a plan as far as those water temperatures continue to rise.
Right. We have a standing emergency contract with Keep Brevard Beautiful to work with volunteers and especially reach out to the commercial fishermen. If in the event of a fish kill, that they would reach out to those folks and use them to harvest the dead fish to remove those nutrients from the lagoon rather than letting them decay and sink to the bottom. So we would prefer to avoid the fish kills in the first place, but we have an emergency plan in place if that happens.
Thank you.
Okay, any last comments?
And I just had kind of a general question. I'm sure that this has probably come up on the committee at some point prior to me being here or something of that nature, but what impact would, I know the question has come up about the salinity a few times, what impact would correcting any salinity issues have, and what would restoring that look like, if anybody knows? That kind of thought occurred to me when the mention of the sea salt herbicide was mentioned.
We talked about rediversion projects, and so the watershed of the lagoon that used to traditionally drain to the Indian River Lagoon, that has changed over time in an effort to reduce flooding and control mosquitoes, drain the marshes of Florida, right? And so more and more of the St. John's Basin has been diverted to discharge to the Indian River Lagoon. And of course, the more canals we put in, the faster that fresh water gets to the lagoon. So it's an increased volume and an increased pace of delivery that creates these salinity issues. So a number of projects have taken place and are currently underway to re-divert that water back to the St. John's. And so Melbourne Tillman talked about the C1 rediversion project. That was a partnership with the district, the control district, the water management district, the Department of Environmental Protection, and the county built a 300-acre stormwater treatment area and added, I think there are now 6 pumps there to stage that water up in the C1 and pump it west into a treatment area to clean it, and then it discharges to the St. John's River instead of to out Turkey Creek to the Indian River Lagoon. They are currently re-diverting about 50% of that water volume west to the St. John's. One of the cost share projects in the plan is the M1 Crane Creek rediversion. So that project similarly is looking at what is the right amount of water that should have been going to the St. John's. And so the design of that project is such to re-divert the right volume at the right rate, the right pace, to go back to the St. John's, and then the rest would still come to the Indian River Lagoon. Next up is the C10 rediversion, which is just south of the C1 rediversion and would take even more of that water that's currently coming through the Melbourne-Tillman control system to Turkey Creek and divert it west to the St. Johns River. We'll see whether the Water Management District's new feasibility study, whether they identify some additional areas. Part of the challenge with the Lagoon watershed in Brevard County is it's so narrow from the northern end of the county until you get to, Melbourne, almost Palm Bay. It starts to widen out. And so you don't have a lot of opportunity, you don't have a lot of watershed to re-divert there. It's only in the southern part of the county where you have those big opportunities. One exception to that rule might be Addison Canal in the north end, but it's hard to do those big rediversion projects and those big stormwater treatment areas when we have 1,726 little outfalls all along the lagoon, and you can't re-divert, every single one of them. And for most of the county, the watershed area hasn't changed significantly, but in the southern part of the county it has, and so that's what those rediversion projects are about.
Are we allowed to talk over here?
I'll allow it, yes.
So I'm involved in a project just looking at the potential benefits of enhancing ocean exchanges. And so as part of that, we're looking at, so again, the geochemistry, changing the dissolved oxygen. And so I have dissolved oxygen data if you're all interested. And the temperature potentially by bringing in seawater, and particularly salinity. And so if we go back to pre-1920s, the watershed to the entire lagoon was somewhere around 550,000 acres. Post-1920, it's about 1.5 to 1.6 million acres. So it's 2.5 times what it was. And forgive me if I'm off by a tiny bit there. But that's an incredible change in the amount of fresh water that is going into the lagoon. And it's channelized. And so before, this area was a slough. It was just percolating into the ground. And so I think that fresh water is absolutely a concern. I'm very happy to see these rediversion projects. And something that there's no data other than anecdotes that's like, water is saltier than the ocean. But we don't know what the salinity was here 100 years ago. If anybody has data, I'd love to see it. But based on the change in the hydrology, I suspect that the entire lagoon is seeing fresher conditions than it was. And so I agree with all of these diversions as long as we're doing it properly and treating as much of the water as we can. And then just another comment. As we think about this, the Brevard Zoo has done a lot of, combined with UF, has done the clam restoration projects, for example. And a lot of these species are not freshwater tolerant. And so there's studies that the Mercenaria, for example, there's many different studies with different salinity tolerances, but a lot of them are showing that below 16, 17, or maybe down to 10 parts per thousand, we see some significant impacts. And so in their most recent stuff, they found that salinity was pretty much the variable controlling survival. Salinity in the lagoon has been virtually continuously decreasing since about 2014. In Banana River, it was 35 in 2014. Now it's about 17 to 19. And so it's linked to El Nino cycles and all that stuff, but certainly probably lower than it would have been pre all of our changes to hydrology. And so the low salinity is impacting the survival of filter feeders, and the most recent reports about seagrasses is that one of the things that can harm seagrasses, so Laurie Morris's paper talks about stress under about 23 parts per thousand. We're at 17 in Banana River. So salinity, just simply fresh water, even if we take out all the nutrients, is still a problem. So hopefully I'm not overstepping.
No, thank you. Vinny?
So yeah, Eric, I remember when when we started here, St. John's Water Management was talking about the redirection, and I thought it was awesome. For me, it's deep wells and residential wells and residential watering. I think a lot of people that do water their yards, if they overwater their yards, that water goes right into our storm system, and then usually it can get treated, but it's fresh. There's no treatment for fresh water, so it gets into the lagoon. And so I think, again, another thing is it's getting hotter and people's grasses would normally be a little browner, but they want them to stay greener, and they're watering more. I think our residential footprint or development footprint is increasing that fresh water into the lagoon. And I've heard people say fresh water is a pollutant to our lagoon, and so I think that's something that we might start looking at more. We were focused on nitrogen and phosphorus, and I think from the anecdotal and what everyone's saying, we've done a good job with that, but maybe we need to start working on some of those ancillary stuff as well.
Okay. Laura Lee?
I don't want to be a mic hog, but I wanted to comment on these brochures.
Okay.
These are incredible. And the work that your staff did, Virginia, on these things, they're stunning. They're absolutely stunning. And I think back to those early, when the Brevard Nature Alliance was working with the TDC and we were cranking out those brochures and stuff. They were primitive compared to these. These are absolute works of art, and I appreciate it. But I want to do a commercial. On Saturday, like tomorrow, at 3 p.m. to 7 p.m., there's going to be a Mosquito Lagoon Stakeholders Focus Group sponsored by the Lagoon Watermen Alliance. So that's mostly fishing guides and people that, are interested in the health of the Indian River Lagoon. Their focus right now is in Mosquito Lagoon because that's where most of them fish. But they're trying to start a chapter kind of like Captains for Clean Water, but over here that specifically deals with the Indian River Lagoon. It's free. It's open to the public. It's going to be at Hells Bay Boat Works. Address is 1520 Chaffee Drive, Chaffee, 1520 Chaffee Drive in Titusville. I've been to a couple of things at Hells Bay Boat Works. They do it right. I mean, it is a great place to go to a function like this. And so from 3 to 4 p.m. will be a presentation about the lagoon. 4 to 5 p.m. a stakeholder-led discussion. 5 to 6 p.m. is an introduction to the Lagoon Watermen Alliance, and then 6 to 7 is social hour. So free food, free booze, you don't want to miss it. I mean, if it's Saturday afternoon, it's very hot outside, and it's air conditioned. My dad's boat plant did not have air conditioning. This is like a really nice facility, and invite everybody to come. Please, come. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Any final comments? Okay.
Yeah, since we were talking about the historical, Charles did the presentation before. If we as a committee member, do we do presentations, or how do we
Yeah, if you have something that you desire, then we can get with Virginia, and then I would propose that we discuss that as part of setting our future agenda and topics and things of that nature. So if you have a desire on some specific topic, please get with Virginia on that, and then as a committee, we can discuss setting our presentation agenda.
All right.
Okay. So thank you, everyone, for their comments, and with that, we will adjourn.
Thank you.
The opinions expressed by any member of the public during any period of public comment do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the Board of County Commissioners of Brevard County, Florida, Space Coast Government Television, or the program sponsor, and are solely those of the presenter. The Board of County Commissioners of Brevard County, Florida, Space Coast Government Television, and the program sponsor hereby expressly disclaim any and all responsibility or liability for any defamatory or slanderous statements expressed by any member of the public during any such period.